had been wanting to get away from everything for a while. My job had started to feel like a cage. I worked in a small office, staring at screens all day, eating the same food, driving the same routes, and going home to the same small apartment that smelled faintly of dust and detergent. I was tired of the noise of the city, the car horns, the traffic, the lights that never turned off. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from people. So I booked a cabin for a week in the hills, about 4 hours north of where I lived. It was a small place, tucked near the tree line with no close neighbors. The pictures online made it look peaceful. A small wooden cabin with a tin roof, a porch that looked out over a slope, and thick trees surrounding it on 3 sides. I left early in the morning on a Friday. The air was cool, the roads empty. I liked that. I stopped once for gas, bought a few snacks and a bottle of water, and kept driving. The further I went, the quieter it got. Towns got smaller, houses farther apart, and the trees taller. After a while, the road turned to gravel. My car bounced a little, and dust rolled up behind me. The GPS showed only a thin gray line, and for a while I didn't see another vehicle at all. The forest looked endless. Pine trees stretched up on both sides, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my tires crunching on the gravel and the hum of the engine. After about 30 minutes on the rough road, I saw the turn. A wooden sign leaned against a rock, half faded, with the name of the cabin on it, Hillside Retreat. I turned onto a smaller dirt path that went uphill. The car shook on the uneven surface. I rolled down my window, and the smell of pine and cold air filled the car. I could see patches of sunlight coming through the trees. The path twisted a few times before it opened up, and there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it was nice. A single story with weathered wood and a porch with 2 old chairs. The roof had streaks of rust on the tin, and a stack of firewood sat under a tarp beside the wall. I parked beside it and got out. The air was still and quiet. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and a few birds in the distance. I stood for a moment just listening. It was the kind of silence you never get in the city. It felt almost heavy. I went inside after unlocking the door with the code the owner sent me. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and a bit of smoke from past fires. The floorboards creaked under my shoes. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living area with a couch and a fireplace, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was simple but clean. The windows were small but clear, and the view outside was all trees. I liked it. It felt private. I unpacked slowly. I put my food in the small fridge, dropped my backpack in the bedroom, and opened the windows to let some air in. It was early afternoon, maybe around 2. The sun came through the trees, cutting through the dust in the air. It was peaceful in a way that almost felt strange. I sat on the porch for a while with a drink in my hand, just looking out over the slope. From there, I could see a trail going down through the trees. The owner's note said it led to a creek about half a mile away. I decided I'd check it out the next day. That first night was quiet. I made some food, lit the small fireplace, and read for a bit. When I went to bed, it took a while to fall asleep because of how quiet it was. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. In the city, there was always something: cars, people, wind against buildings. Here, there was nothing, just still air and the sound of my own breathing. But eventually, I drifted off. The next day, I woke up early. It was cold inside, so I put on a sweater and went outside. The ground was damp from dew. The forest looked calm, and the air felt crisp and clean. I boiled some water, made coffee, and drank it on the porch. I could hear birds again and something that sounded like a woodpecker somewhere far off. After breakfast, I decided to walk down to the creek. The trail was easy to follow, a thin dirt path winding between trees and rocks. I saw a few animal tracks in the mud. Squirrels darted through the underbrush, and once I saw a deer in the distance. The walk took maybe 15 minutes before I reached the creek. The water was clear, cold, and shallow. I stood there for a while, listening to it run over the rocks. I felt calm, more than I had in months. I stayed there about an hour before heading back up. The rest of that day passed slowly. I read more, cooked some food, and wrote in a notebook I had brought along. When evening came, I built a small fire outside in the pit near the porch and watched the sun go down through the trees. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I put out the fire and went inside. Around 10, I got into bed and listened to the quiet again. I remember thinking how nice it was to not hear anything mechanical or man-made. I didn't even have cell service there. No pings, no notifications. Just silence. But the next night didn't feel the same. Started around midnight. I had been asleep for a few hours when I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I heard something. First, I lay still, listening. The cabin was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I could hear the wind moving gently outside, but there was something else too. A sound that didn't fit. It was soft, slow, and irregular. Came from outside, maybe near the porch. It sounded like footsteps, but light ones, not boots or shoes. More like bare feet moving on the wooden boards. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound stopped. I waited, eyes on the ceiling. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard the sound again. Just a few steps, then silence. My body went cold. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too careful. I stayed still, not sure what to do. After maybe a minute, I reached over slowly and grabbed the small flashlight I had left on the nightstand. I didn't turn it on right away. I just held it. The footsteps came again, closer this time. I could hear the boards creak under weight, but not heavy weight. Just enough to make the wood flex. Then silence again. I waited for several minutes. Nothing else happened. I sat there in the dark, heart beating fast, every muscle tight. Finally, after what felt like forever, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the curtains. Nothing moved. I got up, crossed the room quietly, and peeked through the gap. The porch was empty. The woods beyond looked still. Nothing moved except the branches in the faint wind. I scanned for a while but saw nothing. After a few minutes, I stepped back, closed the curtain, and locked the front door again just to be sure. I lay back down, but it took a long time to fall asleep. Every small sound made me tense up. The next morning, I went out to check. The porch looked normal. The boards were dusty, and I could see some faint scuff marks near the edge, but it could have been anything. An animal, maybe a raccoon. The ground below had a few spots of disturbed dirt, but nothing clear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an animal. The way those steps sounded, slow, almost careful, it didn't match the random movements animals make. But I tried to push the thought away. I told myself maybe I was just on edge from being alone. The mind does strange things when it's too quiet. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read more, chopped a bit of wood, cooked, and tried not to think about the night before. But when evening came, I started to feel uneasy again. I made sure the doors and windows were locked, closed all the curtains, and kept a flashlight with me at all times. I even moved one of the chairs in front of the door just to feel better. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake that creeping feeling that something wasn't right. That night, it started again. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, heart already racing, like my body sensed something before my mind did. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark. Then I heard it, the same slow creak on the porch boards. Pause. Another creak. It was deliberate, not random, not wind. It sounded like someone shifting their weight carefully, trying not to make noise. I stayed frozen, trying to listen through the pounding of my heart. The sound came closer to the front of the cabin, then stopped. I didn't hear any knocking or scratching, just stillness. Then after maybe 30 seconds, the boards creaked again, but this time, they sounded like they were moving away, toward the edge of the porch. A few seconds later, silence again. I stayed awake the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight on, just staring at the ceiling until dawn. When morning came, I went outside again. The air was cold, and the ground was damp with dew. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the dirt. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Faint but clear enough to tell they weren't animal. Bare feet. The prints led from the edge of the trees to the side of the porch and back again. The sight of them made my stomach tighten. The prints were small, maybe from someone thin, not big, but they were definitely human. I crouched there for a long time, staring at them, trying to process what it meant. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night. Someone barefoot. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest house was miles away. The only road led directly to this place. Whoever it was had come through the woods. I felt a wave of cold dread go through me. I decided I'd leave that day, but then I realized my car keys weren't on the table where I always left them. I searched the counter, the floor, the bedroom, nothing. I felt my stomach drop. I knew I hadn't moved them. I checked my bag, my jacket, every pocket. Still nothing. The idea hit me like a shock. Someone had been inside while I slept. I tore through the cabin, checking the doors and windows. The locks were still in place. No signs of forced entry, but the keys were gone. I stepped outside again, scanning the porch, the dirt. The tracks were still there. I followed them a little way toward the tree line but stopped halfway. The woods looked thick, dark. I couldn't see far in. My heart pounded. I turned back and went inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of that day was a blur of tension. I kept looking out the windows, jumping at every sound. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt like it was watching me. Couldn't eat. I couldn't sit still. The idea that someone had been so close, walking barefoot around the cabin, maybe watching me sleep, it was too much. When night came, I didn't sleep. I pushed a chair against the door again, then dragged the small dresser in front of it too. I kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife beside me. The hours crawled by. At some point, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard something, not on the porch this time, but behind the cabin. It was faint, like movement through the brush. Then a thud, like something bumping lightly against the wall. I froze. Another soft noise came, this time from the side. Then silence. I didn't move for hours. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. Eventually, I saw faint light coming through the window dawn. I waited another hour before moving. When I finally went outside, I saw it. A small object sitting on the porch, right by the front door. My car keys. They were placed neatly, not dropped. Someone had put them there. I didn't even think. I grabbed them, went straight to the car, and started the engine. It turned over, but I noticed something else immediately. The passenger door was unlocked. I hadn't left it that way. I locked it quickly and started driving down the dirt path, my hands shaking the whole time. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But there was nothing. The forest just stood there, silent and still. I didn't stop until I reached the main paved road. When I finally had cell service again, I pulled over and just sat there, trying to calm down. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone had walked barefoot around the cabin and stolen my keys? There was no proof, no photos, just footprints that would be gone by now. I drove all the way home without stopping. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the car for a long time before going inside. I locked every door and window that night, double-checked them all before trying to sleep. But I didn't sleep much. Every small creak in the building made me flinch. My mind kept replaying the sounds of those footsteps on the porch, the careful weight shifting on the boards, the faint creak that didn't belong to any animal. It's been months since then, but I still think about it. I don't go camping anymore. I don't rent cabins. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear something moving outside my window. When that happens, I just lie still, listening, the same way I did that night, waiting for it to stop. But there's one thing I never understood. The footprints. The way they looked, small, bare, and clean. No mud smeared, no deep heel marks. Almost as if whoever left them had been standing there for a long time, unmoving, watching. I never went back to that cabin again. A few weeks later, I checked the listing online. It had been taken down. No explanation, no reason given. Just gone. I still remember the owner's message before I went. The note that said, asterisk, the key code changes weekly. No one else has access. Asterisk, but someone did, and they were already there. I went to stay in that cabin because I needed to get away from everything for a while. I had been working nonstop for months, barely sleeping, barely eating right, just staring at screens for too long every day. My head felt heavy all the time, and I started to feel like I was living on autopilot. When my cousin told me about his old cabin sitting empty up by Dry Creek, I decided to take a few weeks off and stay there alone. It was far from the main road, surrounded by woods and hills, with no phone signal and no internet. That was exactly what I needed, or at least that's what I thought. I drove there in early October. The road turned from asphalt to gravel after a while, then narrowed down to a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. I remember how quiet it got as I went deeper into the woods. The trees on both sides leaned in close, and the branches brushed the sides of my car sometimes. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs, just the dirt road and the trees that looked older than anything I'd ever seen. The air smelled sharp and damp, like pine needles and mud. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It was just one story, made of old logs that had darkened with age, sitting near the base of a hill. There was a small clearing around it where the grass had grown tall and uneven. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. I could see a narrow trail behind the cabin that led toward the woods, but I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Inside, the place was plain but solid. There was one main room with a small kitchen, a wooden table, and an old sofa facing a brick fireplace. The bedroom was tiny, barely fitting a bed and a dresser. Everything smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke, like no one had stayed there for a while. I unpacked my things, opened the windows to let some air in, and sat down for a while just listening to the stillness around me. It was strange how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, not even birds at that hour. The first 2 days were calm. I spent time walking around the area, trying to get used to the silence. I found Dry Creek about a 15-minute walk behind the cabin, though it was mostly dry now, just a shallow line of mud and a trickle of water running through the middle. I sat by it for a while, just listening to the wind move through the trees. It felt peaceful in a way that almost made me uneasy, like the world had paused completely and I was the only one left moving. At night, though, things felt different. The woods that looked calm during the day felt strange when it got dark. The trees turned into a black wall, and every small sound carried farther. The first night, I couldn't sleep much. I kept hearing what sounded like movement outside. Twigs snapping, dry leaves rustling. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons. It was common in the woods. But every now and then, the sounds would stop suddenly and stay silent for a long time, like something out there was waiting. By the third day, I noticed little things that started to bother me. I found my front door slightly open one morning, even though I was sure I'd locked it before bed. Could have been the wind, but the latch was the kind that didn't just swing open easily. I checked the floor near the door and saw some dirt that looked like it had been tracked in. Not footprints exactly, just patches of darker soil, like someone had brushed through. I tried to shake it off, cleaned it up, and went about my day. That evening, I decided to chop some firewood since the nights were getting colder. I went behind the cabin where the trees were thinner and started splitting logs near an old stump. I kept noticing that trail behind the cabin again. It went deeper into the woods, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed it for a few minutes just out of curiosity. It twisted between thick trees and eventually reached a small clearing. There were broken branches on the ground and an old, rusted metal drum lying on its side. It looked like someone had once used it for burning trash. Around it, I saw what looked like old beer cans, broken glass, and the remains of a small campfire. Whoever used to come here hadn't done it in a long time. When I got back, the sun was low, and the woods were turning dark fast. I started a fire in the cabin and sat by it for a long time, just listening to the wood crackle. I wrote a few notes in a small notebook I'd brought, mostly just random thoughts about how quiet everything was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't completely empty. Sometimes, I thought I saw faint movement through the window, like a shadow slipping between the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was soft, like a scraping sound, coming from outside the cabin. I lay still, listening, It happened again, closer this time, near the side of the wall. I sat up and turned on my flashlight, shining it around the room. Everything inside was still. The scraping came once more, then stopped. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening to every sound until I finally dozed off around dawn. The next morning, I went outside to check. On the side of the cabin near the kitchen window, I noticed deep marks in the dirt, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. There was also a piece of fabric caught on one of the bushes, dark and torn, like from a jacket sleeve. I felt uneasy but tried to reason it out. Maybe someone had been hunting in the area. Maybe they'd passed close by in the dark. Still, I started locking both the door and windows every night after that. On the 5th day, I walked further down Dry Creek, following the shallow waterbed for a while. The farther I went, the quieter it got. I found an old fence half buried in the ground, maybe the remains of a property line. Beyond it, I saw a pile of metal scraps and an old, rusted-out truck half hidden under vines. The windshield was gone, and inside the truck bed, I saw old trash. Cans, torn clothes, even a blanket that looked like it had been there for years. The air around that spot smelled faintly sour, like rot and rust mixed together. I didn't stay there long. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, something was off. The door was open again, not just unlocked, but wide open. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I stepped inside slowly, half expecting to find someone, but it was empty. My bag had been moved from the table to the floor. The small box of matches I kept by the fireplace was gone. I checked the drawers, my jacket, everything. Nothing else seemed missing. I went outside and looked around again, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. It was so quiet it made my ears ring. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was soft, like a scraping sound, coming from outside the cabin. I lay still, listening. It happened again, closer this time, near the side of the wall. I sat up and turned on my flashlight, shining it around the room. Everything inside was still. The scraping came once more, then stopped. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening to every sound until I finally dozed off around dawn. The next morning, I went outside to check. On the side of the cabin near the kitchen window, I noticed deep marks in the dirt, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. There was also a piece of fabric caught on one of the bushes, dark and torn, like from a jacket sleeve. I felt uneasy but tried to reason it out. Maybe someone had been hunting in the area. Maybe they'd passed close by in the dark. Still, I started locking both the door and windows every night after that. On the 5th day, I walked further down Dry Creek, following the shallow waterbed for a while. The farther I went, the quieter it got. I found an old fence half buried in the ground, maybe the remains of a property line. Beyond it, I saw a pile of metal scraps and an old, rusted-out truck half hidden under vines. The windshield was gone, and inside the truck bed, I saw old trash. Cans, torn clothes, even a blanket that looked like it had been there for years. The air around that spot smelled faintly sour, like rot and rust mixed together. I didn't stay there long. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, something was off. The door was open again, not just unlocked, but wide open. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I stepped inside slowly, half expecting to find someone, but it was empty. My bag had been moved from the table to the floor. The small box of matches I kept by the fireplace was gone. I checked the drawers, my jacket, everything. Nothing else seemed missing. I went outside and looked around again, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. It was so quiet it made my ears ring. That night, I couldn't relax. I didn't start a fire because I didn't want the light to draw attention. I just sat in the dark, listening. Every creak of the wood made my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful, crunching the leaves outside. They moved around the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark, trying not to breathe too loud. The sound stayed for a long time, like whoever or whatever it was stood just out of sight. Then, after what felt like hours, it faded away into the woods. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay much longer. Something was wrong out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. But when I went to leave, my car wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. When I popped the hood, I saw that one of the wires near the battery had been cut clean through. I just stood there staring at it for a long time, my hands shaking. Someone had done it on purpose. I didn't have tools or spare parts, and there was no phone service anywhere near. The closest town was over 10 miles away. I told myself I'd wait one more night and then hike out early in the morning to get help. I spent the rest of the day packing my things, checking the cabin doors again, making sure I had my flashlight and my pocket knife ready. When the sun went down, the air felt heavier than usual. The woods were completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I sat in the dark corner of the room, holding my flashlight, listening. After a while, I heard the same slow footsteps again. This time they came straight to the door. The wood creaked under the weight. The door handle moved, just slightly, then stopped. My chest felt tight. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. The handle turned again, then released. I could hear faint breathing outside, like someone standing only inches away from the door. Then the sound moved toward the window. I heard a soft tap against the glass. Then nothing. I sat there all night, not sleeping, not moving. When the first light came through the window, I got up and started walking. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I walked fast through the woods, following the dirt road that led back toward the highway. I didn't stop for anything, not even to rest. My heart didn't slow down until I finally saw the empty road in the distance. It took me over 4 hours to reach the main road. I flagged down a passing truck and got a ride to the nearest service station. From there, I called a tow truck to pick up my car. When the mechanic brought it back later that week, he confirmed what I already knew. The wire had been cut cleanly with a knife. He asked if I'd made anyone angry out there. I just told him I didn't know. I never went back to that cabin. My cousin asked for the keys, and I mailed them to him without explaining anything. I didn't want to talk about it, but sometimes I still think about the woods around Dry Creek, about the footsteps that stopped just outside my door, about the piece of fabric caught on the bush, the cut wire, the matches that disappeared. Whoever was out there wasn't lost or curious. They had been watching, waiting, and if my car hadn't broken down, maybe I would have left without ever knowing how close they were. But that's what haunts me now, the thought that maybe they didn't want me to leave that night. Maybe they wanted me to stay until they were ready to step inside. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the kind of quiet hour when the sun sits low and the light gets soft over the trees. The gravel road leading there was rough, with long stretches of forest on both sides, and I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. The cabin was supposed to be a small getaway spot I had rented for the weekend, just to clear my head and take a break from the city. I had seen pictures online. A simple wooden structure, 1 bedroom, small kitchen, and a porch facing the pine woods. It looked peaceful. When I pulled up, everything looked exactly like the photos. The grass around the place was long, but not overgrown. There was a small path that led around to the back, and the porch had 2 wooden chairs that looked sun-faded. I remember feeling relieved that it wasn't too run down. The air was cool, with the smell of pine and dirt, and there was that steady sound of wind moving through the trees, the kind that fills all the silence out there. I unloaded my bag, locked the car, and walked up to the front door. The key had been left in a small lockbox near the doorframe, just like the host had said. I got it open, turned the key, and stepped inside. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and something else, maybe cleaning spray or maybe just age. The floorboards creaked under me as I stepped across. The cabin was small, just 1 main room with a kitchenette and a short hallway that led to a bedroom and bathroom. Everything looked fine at first. Tidy, quiet, untouched. There was a folded blanket on the couch, a small table, a single chair, and a lamp that leaned slightly to one side. I set my bag down near the table and walked to the back window. From there, I could see the thick trees that ran all the way up the slope behind the property. The sun was dropping lower, and the air outside was beginning to cool. I unpacked a few things, set up my food supplies, and checked the kitchen. It was basic but fine, a small fridge, a gas stove, and some old pots stacked on a metal rack. I opened the fridge to see if the previous guest had left anything, but it was empty except for a single bottle of water. It didn't seem strange at the time. I thought the cleaner must have just missed it. As I moved around the cabin, I noticed small details that gave me a strange feeling I couldn't name right away. For example, the blanket on the couch wasn't folded neatly, just kind of bunched up like someone had been sitting there recently. The garbage bin had a few crumpled paper towels inside. There was even a pair of shoes near the back door, old muddy ones that looked like they belonged to a man. I stood there looking at them for a long time. My first thought was that maybe the owner had left them, or maybe they were just extras left by a past guest. I didn't think much more of it then. I was tired from the drive, so I decided I'd clean things up later. I spent the evening unpacking, cooking some food, and walking outside to stretch my legs. The woods around the cabin felt both calming and uneasy, quiet, but in a way that made me more aware of every sound. Every small branch crack or movement in the brush felt amplified. There was no cell service there, which I already knew, but it still made the silence heavier somehow. When I came back inside, the sun had gone down. I turned on the small lamp near the couch and sat for a while, just listening to the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional noise of wind hitting the windows. I looked around and started noticing how lived in the place felt. Not messy, but not quite empty either. There was a half-used bar of soap in the bathroom, a toothbrush in the cabinet, a damp towel hanging behind the door. That was the first time I really paused and started to feel something was off. I had only booked the cabin for that weekend. The listing had said it would be fully cleaned and empty before each stay. The toothbrush didn't make sense. Neither did the towel. I stood in the bathroom for a minute, looking at the towel. It wasn't mine and it was still damp. That meant someone had used it not long ago. My first thought was that maybe the cleaner forgot to replace it, or maybe another guest had come before me and left in a hurry. I tried to brush the thought off. Still, something about the smell in there, that slightly sour, humid scent of wet cloth, made my stomach feel tight. I locked the doors before I went to bed that night. Both of them, the front and the back. I checked the windows too. I didn't usually do that, but being out there alone made me more careful. I left one small light on in the main room, enough to see if I had to get up at night. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small sounds. Creaks in the wood, faint taps like something brushing against the siding. I kept telling myself it was the wind or maybe small animals. Once, in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something heavier, like a footstep near the porch. But it could have been my imagination. Out there, the mind plays tricks easily. By morning, the light through the curtains felt strange, pale and flat. I made coffee and tried to shake off the unease. The plan was to hike a nearby trail that the host had recommended in the listing. I packed a small bag, locked up, and left for most of the day. The trail was nice, quiet, with a small stream running alongside it, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. The toothbrush, the shoes, the damp towel. I told myself it was nothing serious. When I came back that evening, though, something was different. I noticed it the moment I walked in. The small blanket on the couch was in a different position than when I left. I was sure of it because I had folded it roughly before leaving that morning. Now it was spread out again, wrinkled, almost as if someone had sat there or laid something on it. I walked through the cabin slowly, checking everything. My food supplies were still there, my bag too. But in the bathroom, the towel was gone. I looked around, checked behind the door, and it wasn't there. I checked the small cabinet again. Still gone. That was when the quiet of the cabin started to feel heavy, like the air had weight to it. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the faint groan of wood, felt like something moving. I walked through the bedroom, then opened the closet. Inside were just a few hangers and some folded sheets. Nothing else. But on the floor, near the corner, there were small scuff marks, like someone had dragged something heavy across the wood. Could have been from a suitcase, but they looked fresh, like they hadn't been there long. I started to feel nervous in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't panic, not yet, but more like my body had started noticing something before my mind could fully name it. I decided to check around the outside of the cabin, just to make sure no one was there. When I stepped outside, the evening light was already dimming. The woods behind the cabin were dense and shadowed. I walked around the porch, down the steps, and checked near the back door. There were faint footprints in the dirt. Not from me. They were larger, deeper, and they led toward the edge of the trees. I followed them a few feet before stopping. The forest ahead was dark, and I couldn't see far past the first few trees. I remember standing there, listening, but all I could hear was the faint sound of wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. I went back inside and locked everything again. That night I didn't sleep much at all. I kept the light on, sitting on the edge of the bed, just listening. There were no clear sounds, but every few minutes I felt like I could sense something near the cabin. It's strange how, even without hearing or seeing anything, your body can tell when something isn't right. At one point, near midnight, I thought I heard movement under the floor, soft, scraping sounds, like something brushing along the underside of the cabin. The thought made my chest tighten. The cabin was built on a raised foundation, maybe 2 feet off the ground, so technically someone could crawl under it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or fox, but I didn't go to check. I just sat there in the dim light until I eventually fell asleep near dawn. The next morning, I made a decision to leave early. I packed my things quickly, but before I went, I decided to do one last check outside, mostly to calm myself. I walked around the cabin again, this time crouching near the foundation. That's when I saw the small panel of wood near the bottom edge had been shifted slightly out of place. It wasn't broken, just moved, like someone had pulled it aside. I leaned closer. Behind it was a small dark gap, big enough for someone to fit through. I felt a cold shock run through me. I knelt down, looked closer, and saw what looked like a small sleeping bag rolled up underneath. My breath caught in my throat. Next to it, I could see the corner of a plastic bag with food wrappers inside and a half-empty water bottle. Someone had been sleeping under the cabin. I didn't touch anything. I stood up slowly, backing away. My hands were shaking as I walked back toward the car. The woods behind me felt suddenly alive with sound. Not loud, but sharp, like every small noise had meaning now. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. When I finally got to a spot with cell service, I pulled over and called the rental company. I told them exactly what I found. The signs that someone had been staying there, the sleeping bag, the food wrappers. They said they'd contact local authorities immediately. A few days later, I got a call back. The police had gone to the cabin and found more evidence under it. A small stash of canned food, a few personal items, and signs that someone had been living there for at least a few weeks. They thought it was likely a local drifter, someone homeless who had found the cabin empty between rentals and started using it for shelter. The thought of it stayed with me for a long time. Every night I had spent there, that person had probably been underneath the floor while I was sleeping. The towel, the shoes, the footprints, all of it made sense after that. I thought back to the small noises I had heard at night, the sense of being watched even when I couldn't see anyone. They had probably been crawling out at night to use the bathroom or to get food from the kitchen when I was gone. Maybe they thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe they were desperate, hungry, scared themselves. But what unsettled me the most wasn't just that they had been there. It was how close we had been, separated only by a few inches of wood. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak in my apartment floor made me think of that cabin, of the empty space beneath it, of the quiet person lying there in the dark while I slept above them, unaware. I realized later that what scared me most wasn't that they might have hurt me. It was that I hadn't known. That someone could live so close, move so quietly, and watch from so near, and I'd had no idea until the very end. And when I thought back to that final morning, when I walked around the cabin and saw the panel slightly open, I remembered something else. A faint sound just before I stood up. It might have been my imagination, but it had sounded like someone shifting softly in the dark. Just a slow, careful breath. I had walked away without looking again. That night, after getting the police call, I thought about how easily it could have gone differently. If I had stayed one more night, if I had gone outside after hearing the noise. If I had looked under the cabin instead of leaving. I'm thankful I didn't, because some things once seen can never leave your mind. Even now, years later, whenever I see an old wooden cabin, I still picture that gap in the boards and the rolled-up sleeping bag in the dark. I still hear the quiet sound of breathing, just beneath the floor, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I had been planning that cabin trip for months before I actually went through with it. It was supposed to be a quiet break, something to clear my head after years of working non-stop and feeling burned out by city life. A friend of mine, who owned some property deep in the northern woods, had offered to let me stay there for a week or two. It was an old hunting cabin, built decades ago, with no neighbors, no cell service, and barely a dirt road leading up to it. I liked the idea of being completely alone for a while. I thought it would be peaceful. The cabin was small, made of dark wood with a single bedroom, a small kitchen area, a main living space, and an old bathroom with a weak water pump. It smelled like dust, pine, and something old, maybe damp wood or animal fur. I arrived in the early afternoon after a long drive through forest roads that got narrower the deeper I went. When I got there, the place looked untouched. The windows were dusty, the lock on the front door was stiff, and there were piles of dead leaves gathered on the porch. I remember thinking it was perfect, quiet, isolated, and simple. The first day was calm. I unpacked, swept the floors, and opened the windows to let fresh air in. I could hear only the wind moving through the trees. Every sound echoed slightly inside the small wooden space. I cooked a small meal, went outside to stretch my legs, and sat on the porch as the sky turned orange. There was a stillness to that place that felt different from any silence I'd known before. No hum of traffic, no people, no distant sounds, just forest and wind. When night came, I lit the small propane lantern and read for a while. The light flickered on the walls, and I remember noticing how the shadows seemed to move when the flame danced. The cabin creaked occasionally, the way old wooden structures do when the temperature drops. I told myself it was normal. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch instead of the bed because I liked the warmth of the small fire I'd made in the stove. The first couple of days went by peacefully. I went hiking during the day, explored some trails that led away from the cabin, and took photos. The forest felt endless. Tall pines and birch trees stretching in every direction. There were signs of deer, small tracks in the mud, and once I saw what I thought were bear prints near a stream, but they looked old. I carried bear spray anyway, just in case. I kept telling myself I wasn't completely careless. It was on the third day that I first noticed something that didn't feel right. I had gone for a long hike that morning and came back around early evening. When I opened the cabin door, something small caught my attention. My backpack, which I had left hanging on the back of a chair, was now sitting on the floor beside the table. It wasn't far from where I'd left it, but I was certain I hadn't moved it. I froze for a moment, staring at it, trying to remember if maybe I had done it by accident earlier. I stood there for a full minute, trying to convince myself I must have just forgotten. Nothing else looked disturbed. The food on the counter was still where I'd left it, the window latches were still closed, and the door had been locked when I arrived. I brushed it off as a mistake. Still, it bothered me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin before going out again. There were no footprints that I could see. The ground around the cabin was mostly hard dirt and pine needles. I walked around the back and found only some old tire tracks that looked like they'd been there for months. I decided to stay closer to the cabin that day. That night, something woke me up. I didn't know what time it was because my phone had no signal and I didn't have a clock. The cabin was pitch dark except for the faint glow of moonlight coming through the window. I lay there on the couch, staring into the dark, trying to figure out what had woken me. It was quiet again, completely still. Then I heard it, a light sound outside, like a step on the porch. It was soft but clear enough to make my heart jump. I held my breath and listened. Another faint creak, then silence again. I waited for what felt like a long time, then slowly got up and walked to the window. I couldn't see much outside, just trees and darkness. I thought about opening the door, but something in me told me not to. I just stood there for a while, waiting, before finally going back to the couch and lying awake until daylight. When morning came, I checked outside immediately. There were no clear footprints, just some disturbed dirt near the steps. I told myself maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer brushing against the porch or a raccoon. That seemed reasonable. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On the 5th day, I went to gather some firewood from a small pile near the back of the cabin. When I came around the corner, I froze. There were boot prints in the mud behind the cabin. They were deep and recent, maybe made that morning or the night before. They led toward the woods and disappeared among the trees. I just stood there, staring at them. The size looked about the same as my own boots, maybe a little smaller. I looked around, but there was no one. I remember how quiet the forest felt at that moment. Even the birds weren't making noise. I kept turning in slow circles, scanning the trees. It felt like someone was watching me from somewhere out there, just beyond where I could see. My skin prickled, and I felt a pressure in my chest like something was pressing down on me. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat for a long time. I told myself maybe it was an old hunter or a hiker passing through, but I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. The road that led up there was rough, barely drivable. No one would come up there by accident. That evening, I noticed something else. One of the nails holding the window latch in the kitchen had been pulled slightly out, just enough that the latch hung loosely. I hadn't noticed it before, and I knew I hadn't touched it. It looked like someone had tried to pry the window open, or test if it could be opened. I felt a tightness in my throat as I stared at it. I pushed the nail back in and added a piece of wood against the window frame from the inside, just for my own peace of mind. I didn't go outside again that night. I sat by the stove, listening to every noise. Every creak made me jump. By now, the peace and calm that I had come for were gone completely. I couldn't focus on anything but the thought that someone had been there. Maybe they were still nearby. The forest that had felt peaceful before now looked different. Darker, heavier, like it was hiding something. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises, maybe just the wind, but I wasn't sure. Once, I thought I heard something brush against the wall outside. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The sound went away after a while. In the morning, I packed my things. I decided I'd leave that day. I couldn't relax anymore, and there was no reason to stay. But as I stepped outside to load my stuff into the car, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Behind the cabin, near where the boot prints had been, someone had left something stuck into a tree. A small, dirty piece of cloth tied around a stick, wedged into the bark. It looked deliberate. It wasn't trash or an accident. Someone had put it there. I pulled it out carefully. It smelled faintly like smoke and sweat. My hands were shaking. That was enough for me. I went straight to the car and started it. The engine sputtered and then died. I tried again, turning the key. Nothing. The battery wasn't dead, but it wouldn't start. I lifted the hood, but I didn't really know what I was looking for. Everything looked fine, but something was clearly wrong. For a long time, I just sat there, staring down the narrow dirt road leading away from the cabin. It stretched into the trees, twisting out of sight. It was miles to the nearest paved road. I had no cell service and no one knew exactly when I planned to leave. I felt trapped. I decided I'd wait until morning and then walk. I didn't want to be out on that road after dark. That evening, I built a small fire outside near the porch, just for light. The air felt cold, and the forest seemed too quiet. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something faint. Branches snapping far away, soft movement. I told myself it was animals. When I finally went inside for the night, I double-checked every window and door. I pushed furniture in front of the door and kept a kitchen knife beside me. The night stretched on endlessly. I didn't even try to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard the soft sound of the porch creaking again. Then silence. Then a slow scrape, like something brushing against the wall outside. My body froze. The sound moved slowly along the wall, then stopped near the window. I didn't move. I could hear my own heartbeat. After maybe a full minute of silence, there was a soft tap against the glass. Once, then again. My whole body felt cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the sound stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. When the first light of dawn came, I finally got up and went to the window. The outside of the glass had a smear on it, a faint handprint. Not clear, but visible enough to see the shape of fingers. That morning, I left on foot. I took only what I could carry: a backpack, some food, water, and my flashlight. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I walked fast down the dirt road, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were silent except for my footsteps. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me, faint and distant, but I never saw anyone. I walked for hours. The road twisted through the forest endlessly. My legs ached, and my mouth was dry. At one point, I saw something on the side of the road that made me stop. It was a small pile of stones stacked neatly, 3 of them, one on top of the other. I hadn't seen it before on my drive in. It looked fresh. Someone had made it recently. I stared at it for a long moment, then kept walking faster. By early evening, I reached a wider gravel road. I followed it until I found a sign pointing toward a small town about 6 miles away. My legs felt weak, but I kept going. When I finally reached the edge of town, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I found a gas station and used their phone to call for a tow truck. When we got back to the cabin, the driver got out first to look at my car. He asked what was wrong with it, but I didn't say much. When he opened the hood, he noticed something right away. A small wire had been cut clean near the starter. It hadn't broken by itself. Someone had done it deliberately. He fixed it temporarily, and I left that place without looking back. I never told anyone the full story, just that I'd had car trouble and cut my trip short. But I still think about that cabin sometimes, especially at night when I can't sleep. I think about the handprint on the glass and the footprints behind the cabin. Someone had been there, someone who knew I was alone, who watched me long enough to move things, to test the windows, to wait until dark. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that slow creak of footsteps on the porch and that quiet tap on the window. The drive up the mountain took longer than I expected. It was already late afternoon when I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The tires of my truck crunched over patches of frozen gravel, and every turn felt tighter as the trees grew thicker. The forest was so dense that the sunlight barely reached the road. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and the last cell signal dropped miles back. The quiet up there was heavier than I remembered. The cabin sat deep among the trees, a small wooden place I had rented for a week to get away and finish some writing. It was old but clean from the photos I had seen online. Nothing fancy, just a bed, a small kitchen, a stove, and a generator in a shed behind it. I wanted peace. No phone, no noise, no people. Just me and the cold. When I pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than it did in the photos. The wood siding was darker, maybe from the snow melting and freezing over time. There was no one around, not even tire tracks in the snow except my own. The place looked untouched for weeks. I unloaded my things: a duffel bag, some groceries, a box of firewood I brought from home, and took them inside. The air inside was stale and cold. It smelled faintly of dust and pine. I could see my breath when I exhaled. I started the small propane heater and unpacked slowly, trying to warm the place up. There was one main room with a couch, a table, and a little kitchenette. The bedroom was small, just a bed with thick blankets and a window that looked out into the trees. The bathroom was even smaller, barely enough space to turn around. I spent the first night getting used to the sounds of the cabin. The creaking floorboards, the wind brushing against the windows, the distant cracking of ice on the lake nearby. Every small noise echoed louder than it should. Around midnight, the heater clicked off, and for a moment the only sound was my heartbeat. It was strange how quickly silence could start to feel heavy. The first morning, I made coffee on the stove and went outside. The sky was clear, pale blue, and the ground glittered with frost. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked down to the edge of the woods. I could see animal tracks, probably deer or rabbits, crisscrossing the snow. Everything looked peaceful. It was exactly what I wanted. I spent most of that day writing. The hours passed quietly. The only sound the scratch of my pencil and the occasional groan of wood from the cabin as it adjusted to the cold. By evening, I felt calm, disconnected from the world in a good way. I made soup, ate by the dim yellow light of a lantern, and went to bed early. The next morning, something small caught my attention. My boots were moved. I had left them beside the door on a towel, but they were now turned the opposite direction, facing in instead of out. I figured maybe I had done it absent-mindedly when I came in last night. It didn't seem important. The third day, I went hiking up a small trail behind the cabin. The air was colder, the wind sharper. The snow came up almost to my knees in some spots. I carried a backpack with a thermos and some snacks, and after an hour I stopped to rest. From up there, I could see the roof of the cabin through the trees, smoke rising weakly from the chimney. Nothing seemed out of place. When I got back that afternoon, I noticed something else. The kitchen light was on. I was sure I had turned it off when I left. The heater was still humming, but I remembered checking the switches that morning. I told myself it might have been the way the old wiring worked. Maybe it flickered on by itself when the power from the generator kicked in. I didn't want to start imagining things. That night, though, I couldn't shake a feeling that something was off. The quiet that once felt peaceful now felt like it was pressing against me. Every creak made me turn my head. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the porch. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. By the fourth day, I had gotten used to checking small things before leaving the cabin. I started taking note of details, how I left the chairs, what direction my mug was facing, where I placed my notebook. I told myself it was for my own peace of mind, to stop me from doubting later. That afternoon, I went down by the lake. The surface was frozen solid except for a small patch near the center where the water still moved under a thin crust of ice. I stayed there for an hour just walking along the edge. The cold air stung my face, and the wind made the trees groan. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made me stop. There were footprints in the snow that didn't belong to me. They came from the side of the cabin, near the shed, and went straight to the back door. The prints were shallow, like whoever made them was lighter or the snow had started to refreeze. They didn't match my boot pattern. My boots had wide ridges, but these were narrow and flat, almost like sneakers. The tracks stopped right at the back door. I stood there for a long time just staring. I could feel my heart beating in my chest. The sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the snow. I followed the prints around the side of the cabin, but they disappeared near a cluster of pines. Inside, everything looked the same, at least at first. I checked each room slowly, even opened the small closet in the bedroom. Nothing seemed moved. I kept trying to tell myself that maybe they were old footprints, maybe from whoever maintained the place before me. But the snow was fresh from the storm that fell 2 days earlier. Those prints were new. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on low and lay in bed listening to the sounds outside. Every time the wind hit the cabin, I thought I heard something else. A faint crunch, a rustle, a soft shifting noise that wasn't from the wind. My body stayed tense until the first light came through the window. On the 5th day, I decided to check around the cabin more carefully. The woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way anymore. I walked around the shed, checked the generator, looked for any signs of entry. On the back door, I saw it. A small scratch on the handle, like someone had tried to turn it with something metal. It was tiny, almost invisible, but it hadn't been there before. I went inside and pushed one of the small chairs against that door. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it made me feel like I had done something. By mid-afternoon, I tried to focus on writing again, but my hands kept freezing mid-sentence. I kept glancing at the door, the windows, the edges of the woods outside. Every so often, I thought I saw something move between the trees, but when I stared, there was nothing. As night came, I filled the stove with wood and sat by it, trying to listen to the fire instead of the forest. But then, around midnight, I heard something that wasn't the fire. It was the soft sound of snow being stepped on, slow, careful steps moving outside the cabin. I froze. The sound moved past one side of the cabin, paused, then continued. It wasn't an animal. I had lived long enough in rural places to know the difference. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The only light came from the orange glow of the fire. I waited for minutes that felt like hours. The sound came again, closer this time, near the porch. Then nothing. Absolute silence. I stayed awake until morning. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. There were footprints again, this time all around the cabin. They circled it, stopped by the windows, and then disappeared into the woods. I followed them as far as I could, but they twisted between trees and faded into the shadows. At that point, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been around the cabin at night, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the road down the mountain was narrow and iced over. Driving it in a panic could have been worse. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just until morning, and then leave carefully. That day dragged endlessly. I couldn't write, couldn't eat much. I spent hours sitting near the window, scanning the tree line. Every shape between the trunks looked like a person. Every sound outside felt deliberate. The heater made small popping noises that made my heart race each time. As darkness fell, I filled the stove again, checked the locks twice, and sat with my flashlight beside me. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps outside. Only this time there was something else. A soft scrape, like metal against wood. The back door handle moving. The chair I had wedged against it made a small squeak. I held my breath. The handle turned again, quietly but definitely. Then it stopped. I waited, frozen. My heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Minutes passed. Then, a faint thud from the shed outside. I didn't move until dawn. When the light came, I finally went outside, my body shaking from hours of stillness. The snow outside the shed was disturbed, footprints everywhere, and the door to the shed was slightly open. Inside, the generator was still running, but one of the small gas cans was missing. That was it for me. I packed everything fast. My bag, my notes, whatever I could fit, and loaded the truck. The road down was rough, but I didn't care. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. When I reached the bottom of the mountain hours later, I stopped at a small ranger station. It was closed for the season, but there was a note board where you could leave messages. I left a note saying someone had been around the cabin, maybe trespassing, maybe worse, and described the footprints, the scratches, the gas can. A week later, after I got back home, I got an email from the rental company. They said they had checked the cabin after my message. They found signs of entry. The back door lock had been tampered with, and one of the shed's gas cans was gone, just as I said. But what struck me was the last line. They said that a few days after I left, they found a makeshift campsite in the woods about 100 yards behind the cabin. Inside it were food wrappers, a torn blanket, and a small backpack. No identification, no person, just traces of someone who had been living there for a while. They said it looked like whoever it was had been staying in those woods for at least a week before I arrived. Maybe longer. Sometimes I think about that, about how every night I was there, I was probably being watched. Whoever it was, they had enough patience to wait, to study when I left, to step inside when I was gone. And that thought still hits me harder than anything else. All the little things I brushed off in the beginning, the boots turned around, the lights left on, those were the signs that I was never really alone in that cabin. Now, whenever I think about going anywhere remote, I remember the feeling of that quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like someone's holding their breath just outside your window. And I never went back to any cabin again. I wanted a break from everything. Work had been driving me crazy for months, and the constant noise of the city felt like it was pressing down on me. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, a few hours outside town. It was cheap, old, and had no phone service, but I didn't care. I just wanted quiet. The listing showed pictures of a lake nearby, a wood stove, and a single dirt road leading to it. It looked peaceful, like a place where I could finally shut my brain off for a while. I left early on a Friday morning, just before sunrise. The roads were empty, and the sky was gray and heavy with low clouds. As I drove farther from the city, the surroundings changed slowly. concrete turned into endless pine trees, gas stations grew farther apart, and the air smelled different. Cleaner, colder. The GPS signal dropped when I hit the forest road. From there, I had to follow printed directions. The dirt road was narrow and rutted, twisting through the trees with just enough space for one car. The cabin appeared after about 30 minutes of slow driving. It sat back from the road, half hidden by trees, with a short path leading up from where I parked. It was smaller than I expected, with weathered wood siding and a tin roof. The windows were dark, and the forest around it was silent. There was a metal chimney pipe on one side and a small porch with 2 steps. The first thing that hit me when I got out of the car was how quiet everything was. Not just calm, dead quiet. I could hear the faint creak of cooling metal from the car, and my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. Nothing else. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dampness. The air was cold, but not freezing. It was one large room with a kitchen area, a wood stove, and a bed against the far wall. The only bathroom was a tiny separate room with a sink and a toilet that ran off a small water tank. There was no shower. It felt basic but comfortable. I unpacked slowly, moving around the small space and opening drawers and cabinets just to see what was there. A few old dishes, some firewood stacked inside near the stove, a single knife block with dull-looking blades, a small radio on a shelf with a hand crank. The kind of stuff you'd expect in an old rental place. By mid-afternoon, the temperature started dropping. I lit a fire in the stove using the chopped logs outside. The flames took quickly, and the sound of the fire filled the cabin with a soft crackle that made the silence less heavy. I cooked some canned food on the stove and ate while watching the trees outside the window sway slightly in the wind. It felt peaceful, exactly what I wanted. When it got dark, I realized how deep that darkness was. The windows turned black. No streetlights, no distant glow from a town, nothing. When I stepped out onto the porch to breathe in the night air, it was so dark that I could barely see past the edge of the porch. The sound of the wind in the trees was louder now, and I noticed how it made the branches creak and shift. There were faint sounds in the distance, but they were impossible to place. Just small snaps and crunches, maybe animals moving through the brush. I went inside and locked the door. The latch felt small, not like something meant to keep anyone out. I pushed one of the heavy chairs against it, just in case. I sat near the stove for a while, watching the flames until my eyes got heavy. When I finally lay down, the bed springs squeaked loudly in the quiet room. The only sounds were the wind outside and the occasional pop of burning wood. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. Sometime during the night, I woke up without knowing why. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was dimly lit by orange coals inside the stove. I lay still for a moment, listening. The wind had stopped completely. There was only silence. My ears felt like they were straining to find sound, any sound at all. Then I heard something faint, a slow, deliberate crunch outside, like a footstep on frozen dirt. Then another one. I stayed completely still. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The sound stopped for a moment, then came again. Closer. I stared at the dark window, trying to make out shapes, but there was nothing. Just blackness and my own reflection. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer. The woods were full of them. But something about the rhythm of the steps didn't sound like that. It sounded heavier. 2 steps, then a pause. Another step. I didn't move for a long time. The sound faded eventually, swallowed by the stillness. I lay awake until the faint gray light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally got up and looked outside, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything. Just frost on the ground and pale mist between the trees. I tried to shake it off. The forest played tricks on people, especially when you weren't used to the silence. I made coffee on the small stove and stepped outside with the mug, looking around. The ground was firm, covered in dead leaves and patches of frost. I checked around the porch and near the car. No clear footprints, though the soil was hard enough that it might not have shown. Still, I couldn't help scanning the tree line. The feeling that someone had been standing out there stayed with me. The rest of the day was normal. I went for a short walk down the dirt road and tried to find the lake mentioned in the listing. I never found it, but I did see an old trail marker nailed to a tree, faded and half covered in moss. I didn't wander far, didn't want to get lost. The quiet started to feel less peaceful and more like pressure. Every sound I made, my footsteps, the rustle of my jacket, felt too loud. When I got back to the cabin, I shut the door quickly, like something might have been waiting behind me. That night, I made another fire early, ate dinner, and sat by the stove. I read a bit from a paperback I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. The light from the small lamp barely reached the corners of the cabin. Shadows stretched long across the floor. Around 9, I heard something again. This time it was clearer. A short scrape like something brushing against the wall outside. I froze and turned off the lamp. The firelight flickered across the ceiling as I sat in silence, listening. There it was again. A light dragging sound, slow and steady, along the outer wall. It stopped, then started again on the far side of the cabin, near the window. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe an animal had brushed against it. Maybe wind moved a branch, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded deliberate, like someone running their hand or an object along the siding. I stayed where I was, not daring to move. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Then nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going until early morning, staring at the door. Every creak of the wood made me jump. I could feel how alone I was out there. No signal, no neighbors, no one who'd hear if something happened. When morning came, I went outside again. Even though I didn't want to, I had to see if there was any sign of what I heard. On the side of the cabin where the sound came from, the dirt looked disturbed. Not tracks exactly, just uneven patches where the frost had been broken, like someone had stepped close to the wall. And near one window, I noticed a small smudge on the glass. It looked like the faint mark of a hand. Not clear, just enough to notice. That's when the unease started turning into something heavier. I told myself again that it could have been anything. Maybe I touched it without realizing it when I first arrived. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The window was higher than my reach without stepping onto the porch rail. I decided to stay close to the cabin for the rest of the day. I collected more firewood from the pile outside and kept the axe inside when I was done. The air felt heavier, colder. I didn't feel like exploring anymore. Every time I looked into the trees, I had the strange feeling that something, or someone, was looking back. By late afternoon, I started noticing little things out of place. The door latch on the shed near the cabin was unhooked. I could have sworn I'd closed it before. Inside were some old tools, a gas can, and an old lantern. Nothing looked disturbed, but I latched it again carefully. Then, later, I found one of the firewood logs sitting halfway down the path to the car, like it had been dropped or tossed there. When the sun went down, I locked the door again and pushed the chair back under the latch. I even wedged the axe handle through the chair's arms against the knob. Felt silly, but it made me feel a little safer. Around midnight, I woke again. Not from a sound this time, but from a feeling. The room was cold, the fire had died, and the air felt still and tense. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it. A faint, soft tap against the window. Not hard, not like a knock. Just one tap, then another spaced apart. My stomach turned. I sat up slowly and looked toward the window. The faint orange glow from the stove cast just enough light for me to see the outline of the curtain. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another tap, then silence. I grabbed the flashlight from the floor next to the bed and turned it on quickly, pointing it toward the window. The light reflected off the glass, blinding me for a second. I didn't see anything outside. I stood there for a long time, light shaking slightly in my hand, before lowering it. The rest of the night passed in fragments of light sleep and sudden waking. Every small sound made my heart race. I counted the hours until daylight. When morning came, I checked the window again. There were faint streaks near the bottom of the glass, like something had brushed across it. The frost on the outer pane was melted in thin lines. At that point, I wanted to leave. The problem was, I was deep in the woods, and the nearest town was more than an hour away. My phone had no service, and the idea of driving that narrow road in the dark if something happened felt worse. I decided to stay one last night, then leave first thing in the morning. The day dragged on. The forest was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Even when there was no sound, I could feel something out there. I noticed small changes again, like the shed door open a crack, or the stack of logs looking slightly shifted. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was jumpy because I was alone, but it didn't feel like imagination. It felt like someone was watching, waiting. As evening fell, I kept the axe close. I didn't even bother reading or cooking. I just sat near the stove, listening. Around 8 p.m., I thought I saw movement outside one of the windows. Just a flicker, like a shadow passing between trees. I stared at it for a long time, but nothing moved again. By 10, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I lay down fully clothed, flashlight in my hand. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, it was completely dark. The fire was out. I could barely see the outlines of the furniture. The cabin felt colder than before. Then I heard the door handle move. It wasn't loud. A soft metallic click, like pressure on the latch. Then again, slower. My whole body froze. I didn't move or breathe. The sound stopped. Then came the quiet creak of the porch boards. Someone was standing right outside. I could feel the air shift slightly as if something was pressing against the door. My mind raced. The axe was by the bed, but if I moved too quickly, they'd hear me. I waited, muscles locked, staring at the door's faint outline. Then the handle turned again, harder this time. The chair pressed against it shifted slightly with a dull scrape. Something pulled on the handle again. The chair legs creaked. I forced myself to move. I reached for the axe, grabbed it, and stood up as quietly as I could. The sound stopped. The only noise was my breathing and the faint hum of blood in my ears. Then suddenly 3 loud bangs hit the door in quick succession. Hard, heavy blows that made the whole cabin shake. I stumbled back, gripping the axe tight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. Then silence. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. Whoever or whatever it was didn't try again. When the first light came through the trees, I didn't wait. I packed my stuff fast, loaded the car, and got out of there. My hands were shaking as I turned onto the dirt road. The forest felt endless, and every tree looked the same. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. It took almost an hour before I reached the main road. When I finally saw a gas station, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down. A week later, I got a call from the rental owner. He asked if I'd left the cabin unlocked when I left. I told him no, I was sure I locked it. He said someone had broken in. The place was a mess. The window by the bed was shattered inward, and some of the dishes were broken on the floor. The only thing missing was the small hand crank radio. He said it looked like someone had been living nearby for a while. There were signs of a makeshift camp about 100 yards into the woods behind the cabin. An old tarp, a fire pit, empty cans. I never went back. Even now, sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear that faint sound again. The soft scrape along the wall, the slow turn of the handle. And I always wonder how long that person had been watching me out there in the dark before they decided to come closer. I rented the cabin because I needed quiet. That was the main reason. I had been living in the city for too long. Too much noise, too many people, too many nights staring at my phone until 3 in the morning, feeling like my brain was being squeezed dry. A week alone in the woods sounded perfect. I found the cabin through a small rental site, a plain one-story structure surrounded by pine trees, about 30 miles from the nearest small town. The pictures showed a porch, a fire pit, and a small trail leading down to a lake. It looked perfect. The drive out there took most of the day. The road started smooth but turned rough near the end, a narrow dirt path that twisted through miles of trees. My cell signal dropped halfway there. The sun was dropping low by the time I finally saw the cabin. A dark shape between the trees, small but sturdy. It looked older than in the pictures, but it felt solid, quiet, and peaceful. That's all I wanted. I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The smell of pine needles and damp earth hit me right away. The air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in months. There were no sounds of cars, no voices, not even a distant hum of anything. Just wind and the slow creak of the trees. The cabin itself had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room with a wood stove. Simple, but enough. I unpacked a few things: food, clothes, my camera, and a couple of books, and made a small dinner on the stove. I remember sitting by the window while eating, looking out at the trees. The light was fading. The forest looked endless. When it got dark, it got really dark. No streetlights, no house lights, just blackness outside the window and the faint reflection of myself in the glass. The quiet was heavy. I liked it at first. It was strange but peaceful. I went to bed early, falling asleep to the faint crackle of the wood stove. The next morning was colder. A thin mist hung in the trees. I walked down to the lake trail after breakfast. It wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes downhill through thick brush. The trail wasn't well maintained. Branches scraped my jacket, and the ground was soft from old rain. When I reached the water, it was calm and glassy, surrounded by tall trees that leaned over the edges. Felt private, untouched. I stood there for a long time just listening to the sound of small waves against the shore. On the way back, I noticed something odd. There were old boot prints on the trail, not mine. They were half filled with rainwater, but they looked fairly deep, like someone had walked there before me not long ago. Probably just a hiker, I told myself. Still, it felt strange, knowing someone else had been walking around here. That night, I started a fire in the pit outside. The flames flickered against the trees, and for a while, I just sat there, watching sparks drift up into the dark. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. When the fire burned down, I poured water on it, went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. I remember waking up once in the night to some noise outside. It was faint, maybe just a branch falling. I stayed still for a few minutes, listening. The cabin was silent again, so I went back to sleep. By the third day, I had settled into a rhythm: morning coffee, a short walk, some time reading or writing, then cooking something simple for dinner. The cabin had no TV, and my phone still had no signal, so the quiet filled every moment. Started feeling strange, though. The kind of silence that makes you start noticing tiny sounds. The creak of the walls, the ticking of cooling metal, the soft brush of wind on the roof. That afternoon, I went out back to collect some firewood. The pile was stacked neatly beside the shed, and I remember thinking how organized it was, like someone had recently been taking care of it. There were also a few old tools in the shed: rusty saws, a shovel, a cracked plastic gas can. I didn't think much about it. I took a few logs inside and made a small fire before sunset. That night was colder, and the quiet felt heavier. The wind picked up after midnight, making the trees groan and shift. I woke up again to a faint sound, something light, like a crunch of leaves outside the cabin. Came once, then again closer. I thought maybe it was a deer, but the pattern of the steps didn't sound like an animal. It was too even, too slow. I stayed still in bed, barely breathing, listening hard. There was another sound, softer this time, like a shoe scraping against the porch. I sat up, staring toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I didn't move. I just listened. After a long moment, I heard it again. Asterisk creak. Asterisk, the faint wooden sound of a step on the porch boards. My throat felt dry. I stared at the dark outline of the curtains, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was wind. Maybe a branch had fallen. But then there was another slow creak, closer to the door. I stayed frozen for at least 10 minutes, staring toward the front of the cabin. The sound stopped. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably my mind playing tricks, the way silence and darkness make you hear things that aren't real. Eventually, I lay back down, though it took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were marks on the wood. Muddy prints, not clear enough to tell what kind, but too big to be from an animal. They looked like boot marks. I stared at them for a long time. The steps led to the door and then back down the steps. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. The dirt behind the cabin had a few faint impressions too, like someone had walked close to the back window. I didn't see any broken glass or signs of damage, but my chest felt tight. There was no one around. I stepped into the woods a bit, calling out just to make sure someone wasn't nearby. My voice sounded strange in the air, like it didn't belong there. No answer. I went back inside and locked the door. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone passing through, maybe a hunter, but it felt wrong. There weren't any other cabins for miles. That day I stayed mostly inside. I tried reading but couldn't focus. Every sound outside made me stop and listen. By evening, I decided to put a heavy chair under the door handle, just in case. It made me feel a little better. When it got dark again, I turned off the lights and sat by the window for a long time, just looking out at the dark tree line. Nothing moved. The woods looked like a wall of black shapes. Eventually, I went to bed, leaving the chair against the door. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound again. Slow footsteps outside. Crunch. Then silence. Then another. They were closer this time. My heartbeat thudded in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound reached the porch. I heard the faint creak again, one board, then another. Someone was standing there. I held my breath. Then came the faint sound of metal, like the doorknob being tried gently, like someone testing it. The door didn't move. I had locked it tight. The sound stopped for a second, then the handle turned again, harder this time. The wood made a soft cracking sound. I sat frozen on the bed, watching the faint outline of the door in the dark. The chair under the handle made a soft scraping sound as the door shifted a bit. My hands were shaking. Then nothing. Complete silence. I didn't move for over an hour. When the sun started to rise, I finally stood up and checked the door. The handle had fresh smudges on it, muddy, dark. The prints looked like fingers. That morning, I decided to leave. I started packing right away, throwing my clothes into my bag. I loaded my things into the car, trying not to look at the woods too much. I was halfway done when I noticed something behind the cabin. On the far side of the clearing, near the trees, there was a small shape. It looked like a piece of tarp or fabric lying on the ground. I went closer. It was a dark green backpack, half buried under leaves and dirt. I hesitated but then crouched down to look. The zipper was open, and inside there were some things. An old water bottle, a small flashlight, a pair of gloves, and a folded jacket. It looked like someone had left it there recently. The flashlight still worked when I twisted it. Fresh batteries. The gloves were damp. That's when I noticed something else beside it. The remains of a small campfire, just ashes and blackened stones, hidden behind a fallen tree about 20 yards from my cabin. Someone had been staying there, watching. Maybe. My chest tightened. I felt exposed, standing there in the open. I backed away fast, looking around at the trees. There was no one in sight. I grabbed my bag, ran to the car, and got in. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine hesitated for a second before starting. The sound was too loud, echoing through the trees. I threw it into gear and started driving down the dirt road, not even checking the mirror. The road felt endless. Every turn looked the same. When I finally reached the paved section, I didn't stop. I just kept driving until I saw a gas station. I pulled over there, sat in the car for a long time trying to calm down. My phone signal came back. I checked the time, it was still early morning. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know who. What would I say? That someone had been walking around my cabin at night? That they had a camp nearby? It didn't sound like something anyone would do much about. I told myself it was fine. I was safe now. I just had to get home. A few days later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up the area online, found a map, and realized that the cabin sat near the edge of a large stretch of forest that wasn't private land. There were old trails, abandoned hunting shacks, and a few makeshift camps used by drifters or squatters. It made sense now, the footprints, the backpack, the noise. Someone had been living out there. Maybe they saw the cabin as empty most of the time and were surprised to see someone staying there. But even that thought didn't settle me. There was something about the way they had tried the door, the slow, deliberate way, that didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like intent. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak in my apartment made me tense up. Sometimes I'd wake up in the night, sure that someone was outside my door again. Eventually, I contacted the rental site and told them what happened. They said they'd pass it on to the property owner. I never heard back. I still have the picture I took of the cabin the first day I arrived. It looks peaceful in the photo. Sunlight through the trees, smoke from the stove drifting up. But when I look at it now, all I can think about is the dark space behind those trees. Somewhere out there, someone had been standing, watching the place, maybe for days. I didn't stay in another cabin after that. I can't. Every time I see a picture of one, wood walls, a forest outside, I feel that same tightness in my chest. I remember the sound of that slow creak on the porch boards and the faint click of the door handle turning in the dark. And I remember that I never actually saw anyone. I never saw who was out there. I just heard them, close enough to touch the door. That's what stays with me, the fact that whoever it was, they knew I was inside, and they still tried to get in. That evening, I decided to make a small fire outside to calm myself. I sat near it as the light faded, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see something move. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of movement far back in the woods, a darker shape among the trees, but when I stared hard, it was gone. It might have been nothing, but my chest felt heavy afterward. When I finally went inside, I locked the door again and checked every window. I left one small lamp on and tried to sleep in the loft. But at some point, I woke again in the middle of the night, this time to a clearer sound. It was the distinct noise of the deck creaking under weight. Not just once, but slowly, like someone was stepping carefully. Then the sound stopped right near the door. I held my breath, staring into the dark. I stayed like that for several minutes, frozen. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. Then came another sound, not from the deck this time, but from the side window near the kitchen. It was faint, like a soft scrape against the glass. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When light finally came through the window, I got up and went down slowly. The ground outside the window had a new set of prints, pressed deep into the mud. They were the same kind as before, small, flat, and close together. They circled the cabin halfway before heading toward the woods again. I followed them for a while, heart pounding the whole time. Then I saw something strange. Near one of the trees, there was a piece of cloth stuck to the bark, maybe from a sleeve or pant leg. It looked dirty and old. That's when I realized whoever it was had been coming close to the cabin multiple times. The next day, I tried calling for help. My phone had no service there. The generator worked fine, but there was no signal for miles. I thought about leaving early, but the road back was long and rough, and I didn't want to drive it in the dark. I decided I'd leave the next morning. I packed most of my things that afternoon, leaving only what I needed overnight. That last night was the longest of my life. I sat awake for hours, waiting, listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Movement outside, slow and cautious. This time it was around the back. The generator's hum masked some of the sound, but I could still make out faint steps, a pause, and then another step. My palms were sweating, and I didn't dare move. I thought I heard a low thud near the shed, like something bumping against the wall. Then silence again. I sat there in the dark until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, I saw clear signs near the shed. Footprints again, but now fresher, deeper. And the shed door, which I had latched shut, was open halfway again. Inside, nothing seemed stolen or broken, but on the dirt floor there was a mark, like someone had been sitting or crouching there. That was it for me. I loaded my car immediately. I didn't even make breakfast. As I was putting my last bag in the trunk, I noticed something else. Near the edge of the trees behind the cabin, there was a faint shape that didn't belong. It looked like a small structure, maybe covered with branches or debris. I hadn't noticed it before. It was too far to see clearly, but it gave me a sick feeling just looking at it. I didn't go closer. I started the car and drove down that road without looking back. My tires slipped in the mud a few times, but I didn't stop. I didn't feel calm until I reached the main road, miles away. When I finally got signal again, I called the owner. I told him everything about the prints, the sounds, the open shed. He sounded uneasy and said no one was supposed to be near that area. Later, he called me back and said he'd gone to check with local authorities. A week later, I received an email from him. He said the police found signs that someone had been living in a small makeshift shelter deep in the woods behind the cabin. There were old clothes, food wrappers, and a sleeping bag. Whoever it was had probably been staying there for weeks, maybe months, moving around at night. They were gone by the time anyone checked. I never went back to that cabin again. Even now, years later, when I think about that place, I still remember how it felt that night. That quiet pressure of someone just outside, moving slowly in the dark. Not a ghost or anything imagined, just a person who didn't want to be seen, and that somehow felt worse than anything else. I don't know how long I sat like that. My whole body was shaking, and my throat was dry. Eventually, the noises stopped. No more movement, no more creaking boards, just silence. When the first light came, I went outside. The air was cold and wet. The porch had new prints again, clearer this time. Bare feet. They weren't large, maybe a man's size, but the toes and arches were distinct in the thin layer of mud. Whoever it was had stood right at my door for a long time. That was it. I packed up right then. I didn't care if the truck got stuck. I wasn't staying another night. I threw everything I could fit into the truck bed and started down the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. The road was rough, narrow, and twisted through dense woods, but all I could think about was how close someone had been while I slept. About a mile down, I came to a small clearing where the trees opened up for a moment. That's when I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. To the right of the road, between two pines, was an old campsite. A tarp strung between branches, a fire pit, and scattered cans. It looked lived in, but not by anyone normal. Everything was filthy, torn, and weather-beaten. There were bones near the pit, small ones like from squirrels or birds, and in the dirt near the tarp, there was a pile of clothes, some folded, some just crumpled. Among them was a gray shirt with a tear that matched the strip I had found by the window. I didn't stay to look longer. I drove down that mountain like my life depended on it. When I finally reached the first stretch of paved road, I stopped and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I went straight to the small town police station and told them what I'd found. I didn't mention every detail, just that someone had been prowling around my cabin and that I'd found what looked like a makeshift camp nearby. They sent 2 officers up later that day to check. When they came back, they said they'd found the camp but no one there. Just an old sleeping bag, trash, and some empty cans. A week later, one of the officers called to say they'd learned a man had been living off the land in that area for months. He'd been seen a few times by hunters and hikers. A thin guy, probably in his 40s, avoiding people, sometimes stealing food from cabins when no one was around. They said he must have moved on after I left. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for my deposit. But there's one thing that still sits heavy in my mind. On that last morning, before I packed everything, I checked the inside of the cabin one last time. When I moved the table away from the door, I saw something on the floor. A small, dark smudge, just beneath where the latch met the frame. When I looked closer, I realized it was a faint fingerprint. It was streaked with mud and something darker, maybe dried blood. It wasn't mine. Sometimes I still wake up at night and imagine those slow, careful footsteps coming up the porch again. I think about how close that man must have been. How he stood just inches away from me while I lay there pretending to sleep, breathing quietly, too afraid to move. And I think about how long he might have been coming into the cabin before I even noticed things were out of place. When I dream about it now, I always see the same thing. The door slowly opening in the dark, the faint sound of wet feet on wood, and the feeling that whoever was out there wasn't trying to hurt me right away. He was just watching, waiting, and that's what scares me the most. That whole time, I thought I was alone up there, but maybe I never was. I remember that cabin like it's carved into my memory. It stood miles from the nearest road, deep in a part of the mountains where the pines were so tall they blocked half the sky. I had rented it for a month in early fall, thinking the isolation would help me reset my head after a rough few years. I didn't go there looking for peace, not really. I went there to be away from everyone. The place was old, built sometime in the 1970s according to the owner's listing. It had one main room, a small kitchen, a bathroom that ran off a gravity-fed water system, and a single bedroom in the back with a window that looked into thick woods. The furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The mattress was thin, the table had knife scratches all over it, and the couch smelled faintly of damp wood. But it was quiet. So quiet that on the first night, I lay in bed for hours listening to the sounds my ears weren't used to. The crackling of the cabin settling, the faint drip from the sink, the whisper of the wind brushing pine needles. I had brought enough supplies to last the whole month. Canned food, water, firewood, a generator, fuel, and a small toolkit. I had also brought my hunting rifle, not because I planned to hunt, but because being alone in the middle of nowhere can feel different once it's actually dark. During the day it seemed peaceful, but at night, everything in those woods came alive. The first week was uneventful. I spent most of my time cutting small logs, cleaning the place up, taking short walks on the trails that wound through the forest, and just sitting on the porch staring at the trees. The air smelled different there, a mix of pine, dirt, and cold moisture. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away by a narrow, twisting dirt road, and cell signal vanished completely after the first few miles. I didn't mind. I wanted to be unreachable. By the 8th or 9th night, I started noticing little things out of place. I'd leave the lantern on the small table beside the couch, and in the morning it would be on the counter near the sink. The door to the pantry, which I always kept closed, would be half open. Once, I woke up to find my boots, which I had left beside the front door, moved about a foot to the left. At first, I thought maybe I was doing it without realizing. I wasn't sleeping well. The nights felt heavier, the air thicker, and the forest outside made strange sounds that carried through the cabin walls. The first real thing that bothered me happened around the middle of the second week. I woke up before sunrise because of a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the living room. It was steady and soft, like something being dragged lightly across the floor. My first thought was an animal had gotten in. I stayed still and listened, trying to place the direction. It was coming from near the door. When I finally got up and turned on my flashlight, everything was still. The scraping had stopped. I walked slowly into the living room, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The door was closed. The chairs were where I had left them. I knelt down and looked at the bottom of the door, thinking maybe a branch was blowing against it, but there was nothing, just the still air of early morning. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep again. When the sun came up, I checked the front porch. The dirt there was damp from the night rain, and I saw prints. Not clear shoe prints, more like smudges where someone had stepped and dragged their feet slightly. They weren't mine. I had heavy hiking boots, and these marks were narrower, longer, and uneven. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were just animal tracks distorted by rain. But deep down, I knew they weren't. That whole day, I felt uneasy. I moved the rifle closer to the bed and started keeping the lantern lit longer at night. The woods outside seemed to change. It was the same forest, same trees, same trails, but something about it felt watchful. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig made me stop what I was doing. I didn't go on walks anymore. 2 nights later, I woke again. It was around 3 a.m. this time. I didn't hear scraping, just silence, too much silence. No wind, no creaks, nothing. Then, from the direction of the front door, I heard the faint click of the latch moving. Not opening fully, just shifting. I froze in bed, barely breathing. I didn't have the courage to get up that time. I just lay there in the dark, every muscle tight, staring at the faint outline of the doorway. The sound didn't come again, and after what felt like hours, I drifted off, exhausted. When morning came, I went straight to the door. The latch had fresh scratches on it, tiny, thin lines that weren't there before. I checked the back window too, and that's when I saw something that chilled me more than anything else. A small strip of torn fabric caught on a nail just outside the window frame. It looked like part of a shirt, gray and dirty. That was the first morning I thought about leaving. But it wasn't easy. I had used up most of the fuel in the generator, and the road down the mountain was rough. The truck I'd driven up there wasn't in great shape to begin with, and I didn't want to risk getting stranded halfway down. I decided to stay one more night and leave the next day. That evening, I locked the doors, closed every window, and set the rifle beside the bed. I even pushed the table against the door. I left one lantern burning, its glow stretching faintly across the floorboards. I sat up most of the night listening. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, but careful. The wood planks creaked under the weight. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tightly my hands ached. The steps stopped near the door. Then came a long pause. I could almost hear breathing through the wood, slow, shallow breaths. And then something brushed the door. A soft, slow movement, like fingertips dragging across it. The sound made my stomach twist. I waited, the minutes stretching endlessly. Then I heard the latch move again, this time harder. Faint metallic click. The table against the door shifted slightly. I went up to that cabin in late October. The idea was to be alone for a week and clear my head. I had rented it through a small listing online that showed a few simple photos. A wooden structure surrounded by trees, a small deck, a lake not too far away. The description said it had basic power, a small generator, running water from a tank, and a wood stove for heat. I wanted something quiet. I had been working long hours for months and just needed to get away from everything and everyone. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and rough. I remember how the trees crowded the edges, their branches almost touching the roof of my car as I drove in. It had rained earlier that morning, so the dirt road was soft and muddy. My tires made deep tracks all the way up. There were no other houses nearby. I checked carefully. For miles, there was nothing but forest, rolling hills, and an occasional small stream that crossed under the road. When I reached the cabin, it looked even more remote than I expected. The nearest power line was far down the road, and the air felt heavier there, quieter in a way that made every sound stand out. The trees surrounded it on every side, tall and thick, and the ground was covered with wet leaves. The cabin itself was simple. One main room, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a loft with a single bed. The deck out front had a wooden chair and an old metal table with some rust on it. I unloaded my things from the car slowly, feeling that strange silence around me. It wasn't uncomfortable yet, just very still. I had brought food, water, and enough firewood for the week. The generator was behind the cabin, and when I tried it, it started right away with a low hum. I walked around the place once to get familiar with it. There was a small shed a few meters behind the cabin, half covered in vines, and what looked like a trail leading off behind the trees. That first day was fine. I made a small fire inside, cooked some pasta, and wrote a few notes in a small notebook I'd brought. I remember how quickly it got dark, much faster than I expected. The forest seemed to close in once the sun dropped. When I turned off the lights later that night, the darkness was thick and almost solid, like the cabin was floating in it. I could hear the creak of the wood as it cooled and the faint drip of water from the trees. The next morning I woke up early. There was frost on the grass outside, and the air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I made coffee and stood by the window looking at the forest. Nothing moved. It was quiet in a way I had never experienced. Not even birds at first. I went out to walk around a bit and followed that faint trail behind the cabin. It curved through the trees, went over a small ridge, and ended at a clearing with a large rock. I sat there for a while just listening. I thought I heard a distant noise, maybe a branch snapping, but it was probably just an animal. By the second day, I had settled in. I read, cooked, and wrote in my notebook. Around evening, though, something small happened that stayed in my head. I went outside to bring in more firewood, and I noticed faint shoe prints near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. Mine were thicker from my hiking boots, but these looked smaller, lighter. Maybe someone had come by earlier in the week before I arrived, but I wasn't sure. The mud around the area looked fresh enough that it bothered me a little. Still, I told myself it was probably the property owner or some maintenance guy checking things. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why, but the room felt colder than before. I could hear the faint sound of wind outside, but it wasn't strong. Then there was another sound, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. It was slow, uneven, and light. I waited and tried to convince myself it was just a branch moving in the wind. But the sound came again, closer this time, like steps on the wooden deck. I didn't move for a while. The sound stopped after a minute. I stayed still, staring at the dark ceiling until I eventually fell asleep again. When I got up in the morning, I went straight to the front door and opened it carefully. The air was cold and damp, and the deck was wet from dew. I looked around, nothing seemed disturbed. But when I looked at the edge of the steps, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were more footprints. They were smaller than mine again and led from the side of the deck down into the woods. I followed them for a few meters before they disappeared into the leaves. That day, I tried to focus on other things. I went fishing at the small lake I had seen on the map. It was about a 20-minute walk through the trees. The water was still and gray under the cloudy sky. I stayed there most of the afternoon and caught nothing. When I returned to the cabin around sunset, I felt calmer. But as I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed something that made my chest feel tight. The shed door behind the cabin, which I had closed the first day, was slightly open. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. The opening was small, just a few inches, but enough to show the dark inside. I walked over slowly and pushed the door open with my boot. The smell of damp wood came out. Inside were a few tools, an old shovel, some metal cans, and a plastic container with nails. Nothing looked moved, but I couldn't remember if the shovel had been leaning that way before. I closed it again and slid the latch over it. That night, I made sure every window was locked. I left one small light on in the kitchen and kept the generator running low. Around midnight, I heard another sound outside. Not footsteps this time, but something faint, like a quiet shuffle near the wall. It lasted only a few seconds, then nothing. My pulse stayed fast for a long time after. The next morning, I decided to check around the property again in daylight. I found fresh prints again near the back of the cabin, close to the shed. They led toward the trail behind the trees. The ground there was soft enough to keep their shape. I knelt down and looked closely. They were indeed human. Not boots, but maybe sneakers or something flat-soled. I followed them a bit, but they disappeared past the ridge where the leaves were thick. For the rest of the day, I tried to shake off the feeling that someone was nearby. I kept telling myself it was just a hunter or hiker who'd wandered through. But by then, the quiet no longer felt peaceful. Every sound made me tense. The rustle of leaves, the creak of the roof, even the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud. I remember that cabin like it's carved into my memory. It stood miles from the nearest road, deep in a part of the mountains where the pines were so tall they blocked half the sky. I had rented it for a month in early fall, thinking the isolation would help me reset my head after a rough few years. I didn't go there looking for peace, not really. I went there to be away from everyone. The place was old, built sometime in the 1970s according to the owner's listing. It had one main room, a small kitchen, a bathroom that ran off a gravity-fed water system, and a single bedroom in the back with a window that looked into thick woods. The furniture looked like it had been there for decades. The mattress was thin, the table had knife scratches all over it, and the couch smelled faintly of damp wood. But it was quiet. So quiet that on the first night, I lay in bed for hours listening to the sounds my ears weren't used to. The crackling of the cabin settling, the faint drip from the sink, the whisper of the wind brushing pine needles. I had brought enough supplies to last the whole month. Canned food, water, firewood, a generator, fuel, and a small toolkit. I had also brought my hunting rifle, not because I planned to hunt, but because being alone in the middle of nowhere can feel different once it's actually dark. During the day, it seemed peaceful, but at night, everything in those woods came alive. The first week was uneventful. I spent most of my time cutting small logs, cleaning the place up, taking short walks on the trails that wound through the forest, and just sitting on the porch staring at the trees. The air smelled different there. A mix of pine, dirt, and cold moisture. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away by a narrow, twisting dirt road, and cell signal vanished completely after the first few miles. I didn't mind. I wanted to be unreachable. By the 8th or 9th night, I started noticing little things out of place. I'd leave the lantern on the small table beside the couch, and in the morning it would be on the counter near the sink. The door to the pantry, which I always kept closed, would be half open. Once, I woke up to find my boots, which I had left beside the front door, moved about a foot to the left. At first, I thought maybe I was doing it without realizing. I wasn't sleeping well. The nights felt heavier, the air thicker, and the forest outside made strange sounds that carried through the cabin walls. The first real thing that bothered me happened around the middle of the second week. I woke up before sunrise because of a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the living room. It was steady and soft, like something being dragged lightly across the floor. My first thought was an animal had gotten in. I stayed still and listened, trying to place the direction. It was coming from near the door. When I finally got up and turned on my flashlight, everything was still. The scraping had stopped. I walked slowly into the living room, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The door was closed. The chairs were where I had left them. I knelt down and looked at the bottom of the door, thinking maybe a branch was blowing against it, but there was nothing, just the still air of early morning. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep again. When the sun came up, I checked the front porch. The dirt there was damp from the night rain, and I saw prints. Not clear shoe prints, more like smudges where someone had stepped and dragged their feet slightly. They weren't mine. I had heavy hiking boots, and these marks were narrower, longer, and uneven. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were just animal tracks distorted by rain. But deep down, I knew they weren't. That whole day, I felt uneasy. I moved the rifle closer to the bed and started keeping the lantern lit longer at night. The woods outside seemed to change. It was the same forest, same trees, same trails, but something about it felt watchful. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig made me stop what I was doing. I didn't go on walks anymore. 2 nights later, I woke again. It was around 3 a.m. this time. I didn't hear scraping, just silence, too much silence. No wind, no creaks, nothing. Then, from the direction of the front door, I heard the faint click of the latch moving. Not opening fully, just shifting. I froze in bed, barely breathing. I didn't have the courage to get up that time. I just lay there in the dark, every muscle tight, staring at the faint outline of the doorway. The sound didn't come again, and after what felt like hours, I drifted off, exhausted. When morning came, I went straight to the door. The latch had fresh scratches on it, tiny, thin lines that weren't there before. I checked the back window too, and that's when I saw something that chilled me more than anything else. A small strip of torn fabric caught on a nail just outside the window frame. It looked like part of a shirt, gray and dirty. That was the first morning I thought about leaving. But it wasn't easy. I had used up most of the fuel in the generator, and the road down the mountain was rough. The truck I'd driven up there wasn't in great shape to begin with, and I didn't want to risk getting stranded halfway down. I decided to stay one more night and leave the next day. That evening, I locked the doors, closed every window, and set the rifle beside the bed. I even pushed the table against the door. I left one lantern burning, its glow stretching faintly across the floorboards. I sat up most of the night listening. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, but careful. The wood planks creaked under the weight. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tightly my hands ached. The steps stopped near the door. Then came a long pause. I could almost hear breathing through the wood, slow, shallow breaths. And then something brushed the door. A soft, slow movement, like fingertips dragging across it. The sound made my stomach twist. I waited, the minutes stretching endlessly. Then I heard the latch move again, this time harder. Faint metallic click. The table against the door shifted slightly. It started as a trip I planned to clear my head. I had been feeling burned out from work, tired of screens, tired of city noise, tired of people. I wanted somewhere quiet, far from everything. A small cabin I found listed online seemed perfect. It was deep in the woods of northern Montana, close to a frozen lake, and advertised as off-grid but with a working wood stove, solar lights, and a water pump. The pictures showed a small wooden structure surrounded by pines. No neighbors in sight. I booked it for a week, packed food, water, and winter gear, and drove out early one Friday morning. The first few hours of the drive were easy, just highways and gas stations. Once I got closer to the mountains, the roads narrowed, and snow began to fall. It was light at first, then heavier as I climbed higher. My phone signal started flickering on and off. The GPS kept rerouting before finally freezing completely. I had printed directions just in case, so I followed those, counting landmarks as I went. An old bridge, a long dirt stretch, then a faded green sign pointing to a Forest Service road. That last stretch felt endless. It was about 15 miles of gravel road, winding through trees that grew thicker the farther I went. The snow covered most of the ground by then, and tire tracks from older vehicles had frozen into deep ruts that pulled my car side to side. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel tight. After what felt like hours, I saw a wooden post with a number burned into it, 12B. According to the directions, that was the cabin's marker. I turned onto the narrow drive, branches scraping along both sides of my car, until the trees opened to a small clearing. The cabin looked smaller than in the pictures and older too. The logs were darkened by weather, the roof coated in white, the windows frosted over. A short metal chimney puffed faint smoke from the last visitor, maybe days ago. I stepped out, my boots sinking into fresh snow that reached halfway up my shins. The air was so cold it bit my lungs. I stood there for a while, breathing it in, watching my breath drift in pale clouds. It was quiet, so quiet that the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the slow creak of trees bending in the wind. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and ash. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was a small table by the window, a single bed, and shelves lined with old camping gear and canned food. A black iron stove stood in one corner with a small pile of chopped wood beside it. The back room was just a storage space with tools, rope, and an old gas lantern. Everything looked untouched for months, maybe longer. I dropped my bag on the bed and got to work. I lit a fire in the stove, the wood catching fast with dry pops and cracks. The room slowly filled with warmth. I unpacked food and water, stacked the rest of my supplies in the corner, and took a look around outside before it got dark. The clearing behind the cabin sloped down toward the lake, maybe 200 feet away. The lake was frozen solid, covered in a thin layer of snow, and surrounded by dense trees on all sides. There were faint animal tracks across the surface, small ones, maybe fox or rabbit. The wind carried a constant low whistle through the branches. There were no other cabins nearby, no trails, no roads in sight. I felt completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. That first night was peaceful. I cooked canned soup on the stove, ate by firelight, then climbed into the bed wrapped in thick blankets. The fire crackled softly. I remember thinking it was the first time in months I had felt completely disconnected from everything. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind pressing against the walls. I woke in the middle of the night for no clear reason. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim except for the faint orange glow from the stove. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m. At first, I thought I heard something outside, a light crunching sound, like footsteps in snow. I sat still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, then stopped completely. The silence that followed was so deep that my ears rang. After a while, I told myself it was probably a branch falling or snow sliding off the roof. I fed a few more pieces of wood into the fire, watched the flames climb, and stayed awake for an hour before sleep finally pulled me back down. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. Snow had fallen again overnight, but near the side wall I noticed prints. Single tracks, clear and spaced apart like a person walking slowly. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin and stopped right near the small window beside the bed. I crouched down, studying them. The shape looked like boots. The snow inside each print had melted slightly and refrozen, meaning they were probably made before the temperature dropped last night. I followed them toward the tree line, but they faded halfway there, lost among other older indentations. I stood there staring into the forest, wondering if someone had been there watching me. The cabin wasn't supposed to have any neighbors within miles. I didn't like the idea of someone walking up at night while I slept a few feet away, but I told myself it could have been an old track from another visitor. Maybe someone from earlier that week had come looking for firewood. Still, the prints made me uneasy. I spent most of that day chopping more wood and exploring around the lake. The silence out there was strange. It wasn't peaceful anymore, just heavy. Every sound carried far. Even the crunch of snow under my boots seemed louder than it should. I walked around to the far side of the lake where the trees grew tighter, almost forming a wall. I found signs of animals, broken branches, droppings, but also something else. An old fire ring made of stones, half buried in snow. There were pieces of burned metal cans and glass in the ash. Someone had camped there not too long ago. That night, I made sure to latch the door and keep the fire strong. The wood crackled louder than before, and every gust of wind made the cabin groan slightly. I couldn't stop thinking about the prints and the fire ring. The thought of someone else being out there in that huge forest bothered me more than I wanted to admit. When I finally drifted off, I slept light, waking up every time the fire shifted. At around 2 a.m., I woke again. The sound that pulled me out of sleep wasn't wind this time. It was a dull, slow creak from somewhere outside, like a board bending under weight. My heartbeat picked up. I listened, not moving. Another creak closer. I strained my ears, trying to tell if it was the porch or the side wall. Then I heard it. A soft scrape against the cabin's outer wall. I could almost feel the vibration through the wood. My mind tried to come up with explanations. A branch swaying against it, snow slipping off, but it sounded too deliberate, too slow. I reached for the flashlight by the bed, flicked it on, and aimed it at the window. The beam hit frost and bounced back, showing only my reflection. The scraping stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I put another log in the stove and sat there staring at the flames until morning light crept through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I saw fresh tracks again. This time clearer, newer. They circled the cabin once, coming close to the windows, then trailed off toward the trees. I knelt and measured one with my hand. They were human for sure, about the size of my own boots. The space between steps looked normal, not like someone running, just walking slow. The next morning, I left the cabin at first light, determined to investigate the source of the noise. I stayed close to the clearing, searching the forest floor for tracks. The ground was soft, and soon I found something that made my stomach tighten. Boot prints, large and heavy, partially obscured by leaves and dirt. They led from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin, and then back into the forest. Whoever had been there had left no trace of lingering around the cabin itself, as though they had come for observation, not confrontation. The thought unsettled me, but also clarified something. I wasn't in immediate danger, and this was someone who did not want to be noticed. I returned to the cabin, heart still pounding, and spent the day reinforcing the door with a plank I found in the shed behind the cabin. I secured the windows as best I could and made sure I had water, food, and firewood ready. I realized that my isolation, once a desired escape, was now a vulnerability. For the next 2 days, the forest remained quiet. I explored cautiously, always keeping the cabin within sight. Each step, each rustle set my nerves on edge, but I learned to observe more than react. I noticed small signs of wildlife, the broken branch of a deer trail, a beehive in the hollow of a tree, a fox's footprints in the dirt. The forest was alive, but not threatening. And yet, the memory of the unknown presence lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my mind. On the third night, I woke again, this time not to footsteps or dragging sounds, but to the distinct crack of a branch snapping very close to the cabin. I grabbed my knife, careful not to make noise, and strained to see through the darkness. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent, deliberate, and watching. I stayed frozen until the sound moved away, eventually fading into the distance. Sleep became fitful, filled with dreams of being surrounded, of unseen eyes watching me from the forest. By the fourth day, I realized that I had to leave if I wanted to be safe. The forest had become both a haven and a trap. I spent the morning packing, making sure I had every item accounted for, and loaded my car with a sense of relief. The drive out of the forest was nerve-wracking. The dirt roads were narrow, and every bend seemed like it could conceal another pair of eyes. But daylight and movement were comforting. By the time I reached the highway, I felt the tension of the past days lift gradually. I didn't stop for food or water until I reached a small town several miles away. Sitting in a diner with the hum of conversation and the smell of coffee, I realized how profoundly the experience had affected me. The cabin, the isolation, the unknown presence in the forest, all of it had been terrifying, but I had survived. I had remained alert, cautious, and careful, and that vigilance had kept me safe. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin to retrieve some forgotten items. The forest seemed smaller, less threatening in the light of day, and I walked the same paths without the same sense of dread. The footprints I had found before were gone, washed away by rain and wind. I realized that the presence in the forest had been human, likely someone using the forest for reasons I couldn't understand, but they had posed no active threat as long as I remained cautious and observant. I left the cabin for good that day, feeling a sense of closure. I had faced fear in a raw, unembellished form, learned to trust my instincts, and returned to safety. It was a sharp, vivid lesson in vigilance, isolation, and self-reliance, one that left me both wary and deeply appreciative of the ordinary, everyday safety of the world outside the forest. I never returned to that cabin again, but the memory stayed with me. The forest was beautiful, alive, and utterly indifferent to human presence. The scare I experienced there had been real, grounded in the ordinary. The sounds of someone else in the woods, the potential danger that comes with isolation, the unnerving knowledge that at any moment I could be discovered, hurt, or trapped. And yet, I had left intact, careful, prepared, and vigilant, with the lessons of those nights etched into my mind forever. I had been planning this trip for months, and the thought of finally being in the wilderness alone, away from everyone, excited me beyond words. The cabin I rented was remote, nestled deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The address promised isolation, and that's exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, food that would last a week, a first aid kit, and extra layers of clothing. I brought my old hunting knife, not because I expected trouble, but because it made me feel safer. My car was loaded with supplies and gear, and the drive itself was long and winding. Every mile into the forest felt like leaving the world behind, and I loved it. When I finally arrived, the sun was low, a dull orange light filtering through the tall pines. The cabin looked even more secluded than in the pictures. It was a small wooden structure, weathered and dark, with a single chimney and a porch that sagged slightly at one end. Around it, the forest stretched endlessly, thick with trees and undergrowth. I parked, unloaded my things, and walked up the steps to the door. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small but functional. There was a main room with a wood stove, a small table and chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and a loft where the bed was. The wood floor creaked under my weight, and the smell of old pine mixed with dust and dampness filled the air. I spent the first few hours unpacking and organizing. I stacked firewood near the stove, laid out my food in the small kitchen area, and checked the windows and doors to make sure they all closed tightly. Everything felt quiet, too quiet in a way that made me aware of how isolated I was. There were no sounds of cars, no distant voices, nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. By evening, I had a small fire going in the stove. Its warmth filled the cabin, and I started cooking my dinner. The process of chopping vegetables and frying meat was comforting, grounding me in the mundane. I ate slowly, savoring the feeling of solitude. Night came faster than I expected. Once it was dark, I sat by the fire with a book, occasionally glancing out the window. The woods looked dense, black shadows between the trunks. The wind rustled leaves and branches, and I could hear small animals moving through the undergrowth, but nothing alarming. I went to bed early, exhausted from the long drive and the effort of setting up. The loft bed creaked under me as I lay down, and I listened to the soft sounds of the forest through the open window. I felt safe, or at least I thought I did. The first night passed without incident. I woke several times, hearing the wind and the occasional snap of a branch, but it never felt threatening. In the morning, the sun came through the trees, casting golden light over the forest floor. I prepared a simple breakfast, coffee and bread, then went for a short walk around the cabin. The area was surrounded by dense trees, moss-covered rocks, and uneven ground. I noticed animal tracks near the cabin, probably deer or raccoon, but nothing unusual. The forest was alive, and I felt both exhilarated and slightly uneasy. The isolation that I had sought now carried a sense of vulnerability. For the next few days, I settled into a routine. I woke with the sun, made breakfast, and spent the mornings exploring the forest, marking trails and noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I carried my knife and a small flashlight, though I tried to avoid going far in the dark. I collected firewood, maintained the stove, and kept my supplies organized. At night, I built fires, cooked meals, and read or wrote in my journal. The sense of solitude was intense but calming, a rare opportunity to be completely alone. Yet, as the days passed, I began noticing small, unsettling details. The first sign that something was off came when I found my firewood pile disturbed one morning. It wasn't a huge mess, just a few logs moved, but it was enough to make me pause. I remembered stacking the pile neatly the night before. I assumed an animal had been rummaging around and took care to restack the wood. The next day, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were faint, and I couldn't tell exactly what had made them, but they weren't animal tracks. They looked like shoe prints, small and narrow, and they led into the trees and disappeared. My heart raced, but I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination. Then, one evening, I was cooking dinner when I heard a sound outside, soft, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I froze, knife in hand, and waited. The sound stopped. I went to the window and peered out, but saw nothing. The porch was empty, the cabin surrounded by trees and shadows. My stomach tightened. I sat down again, trying to calm myself, attributing the sound to an animal or a falling branch. But sleep was restless that night. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of the wind, made me tense. I kept thinking about the footprints and the moved firewood. The feeling of being watched was creeping into my mind. The next day, I decided to be more cautious. I stayed close to the cabin, checked all the windows and doors, and kept the knife on the table while I worked. In the afternoon, I ventured a little further, following a small trail that led downhill toward a creek. The forest was thick and the trail was narrow. I enjoyed the walk, but my attention was constantly drawn to every sound. Birds taking off, leaves rustling, twigs snapping underfoot. It all made my pulse quicken. When I reached the creek, I felt slightly better, seeing the sunlight reflecting off the water, the gentle flow a calming presence. I stayed there for a while, washing my hands, drinking some water, and taking in the forest. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something else. A small pile of stones arranged near the edge of the porch. They weren't there before. I didn't recognize any pattern in them, but their deliberate placement made me uneasy. I took them inside and put them on the table, feeling a rising tension in my chest. That night, I slept fitfully, constantly waking to check the windows and the door. Every sound outside, every shadow seemed like a threat. By the fifth day, I realized I had to act. I couldn't wait forever. I packed the backpack with essentials, filled the water bottles, and planned my escape carefully. I had noticed a faint trail leading downhill, hidden under leaves and branches. It would be slow, exhausting, but it was my only chance. I waited until the afternoon, when the shadows were shorter, and the light made it easier to see movement. Then I slipped out the back door, moving silently. The forest seemed endless. Every sound, the snap of a branch under my foot, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the figure to appear at any moment. Hours passed. I stopped only briefly to rest, my muscles burning, my lungs screaming from the effort of climbing down the steep slope. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw a small dirt road. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the road, waving my arms when a car appeared in the distance. The driver stopped, and I finally felt safe again. I explained in broken sentences that I had been alone in a cabin, someone or something had been following me, watching me. The driver nodded, calling the authorities as we drove back to town. When I returned with them the next day, the cabin was empty. No sign of anyone had been there recently, no signs of forced entry, nothing but the small footprints in the mud and the rearranged food. The police didn't find anything suspicious, but I didn't care. I had my life and I had escaped. After that experience, I never went back to isolated cabins. I never underestimated the quiet danger that can exist in isolation. The way that fear can creep slowly into your mind and make everything feel dangerous, even when nothing is obvious. The forest, once a place of peace, was now a place I could only remember with tension in my chest. Every detail burned into my memory. The smell of cold wood smoke, the creak of old logs, the sound of tapping at night, and the figure that watched silently from the trees. Over time, I told myself I was lucky. I survived. I had stayed calm enough to think, to plan, to escape. And that was the only thing that mattered. The cabin, the forest, the tapping, they were just part of a reality I had underestimated. But I had learned my lesson. Isolation can hide danger, and sometimes the most terrifying thing is simply being alone and aware that someone else is not far away, waiting, watching, silent and patient. Even years later, I remember every small detail. The way the light fell through the cracks in the logs, the sound of the wind through the trees, the frost on the windows, the way my hands shook when I gripped the hatchet. And I am grateful that I acted, that I didn't freeze completely. The ending was clear. I left alive, unhurt, and I survived. But it took every ounce of attention, patience, and endurance I had. That cabin will always remain a warning in my mind. A reminder that sometimes survival depends on small, careful steps and the refusal to ignore the signs around you. I had been planning this trip for months, carefully marking every turn on the map, packing every tool I might need, and thinking through every possible scenario that could happen. I wanted a real escape, a place away from phones, from city noise, from the endless small worries that built up around me like layers of dust. The cabin was supposed to be perfect. A small, isolated structure deep in the mountains, far from the nearest road and surrounded by dense forest. It was old but well-maintained, with thick logs for walls, a stone fireplace, and a tin roof that had weathered decades of snow and rain. When I arrived, the world seemed to shrink to just me and that cabin, the forest, and the occasional cry of a distant animal. The first few hours were calm, almost meditative. I carried my pack inside, unpacked my small stove, my food, my extra blankets, and a few books. The sun was low in the sky, pouring an orange light through the windows and painting long shadows across the rough wooden floor. I lit the fireplace, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin, and sat on the worn rug in the center of the main room, listening to the sound of the fire crackling and the wind through the trees. I felt entirely alone and completely safe. Night came, as it always does, slowly and without ceremony. The forest outside shifted in darkness, the trees swaying and the wind picking up. At first, the sounds were comforting, like a lullaby. The occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. But after a while, I realized how unusually quiet it had become. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, no distant animal noises. Only the wind occasionally. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that the animals had gone silent for the night, but unease settled in a small, hard knot in my stomach. I checked the windows, the doors, every lock I could find. Even though the cabin had no electricity or sophisticated security, everything was fine. The locks held, the windows were solid, the walls strong. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sense that someone, or something, was there beyond the tree line. I made myself busy, lighting candles and checking my supplies again, trying to keep my mind occupied. But then I heard it. A faint, deliberate crunch on the forest floor outside, like someone walking in heavy boots, slow and careful. I froze, every muscle in my body rigid. I could hear the crunches coming closer, pausing, moving sideways, then stepping forward again. There was no rhythm, no rushing footsteps, just careful, slow movement, and the sense that it was circling the cabin. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up a small hatchet from the corner. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a deer, maybe a wild animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Hours passed like that, with me sitting on the floor, clutching the hatchet, listening to every footstep, every crack of a branch. I tried to rest, tried to tell myself that dawn would bring safety, but the night seemed endless. I counted the hours in my head, trying to stay awake but also trying not to panic. I could hear the wind picking up outside, branches scraping the walls, and a low, constant sense of presence just beyond the edge of the trees. At some point, I realized the fire had died down, leaving the cabin dim and shadowy. I lit another log, the flames throwing flickering light against the walls, but it didn't help. The feeling didn't leave. The next day, I stayed mostly inside, checking the windows constantly, peering out at the forest. It looked calm, peaceful even, but I knew better. Something had been here, close, watching, maybe following me before I even arrived. The forest had a different tone now, less a sanctuary and more a trap. I decided to explore carefully, but even as I walked outside, the crunch of my own boots on the snow-covered ground reminded me how isolated I was. Every shadow seemed longer, every branch seemed poised to snap under invisible weight. I found tracks, heavy boots, deep in the soft earth, circling the cabin, moving away, then returning. Someone had been there the night before. I realized the danger fully then, understanding that this was not the forest's natural silence. Someone had been following me, watching my arrival, possibly waiting for the right moment. I went back to the cabin quickly, locking doors and windows again, checking every corner. Panic and adrenaline battled for dominance. For the next 2 days, I barely slept, my senses on high alert. Every noise outside made me jump. I barricaded myself inside as best as I could, moving furniture against doors, stacking firewood under windows. I used the fireplace constantly, burning logs to give light and warmth, even though it wasn't cold. I kept a knife, a hatchet, and a small gun with me at all times. I rationed food carefully, moving only when necessary, and I avoided the temptation to go outside alone. Every movement in the forest, every wind-blown leaf, every crack of a branch, felt like a signal, a warning. I started noticing small details, things that I had ignored before. Footprints at the edge of the clearing. A small pile of rocks that hadn't been there the day I arrived. Branches deliberately snapped to make noise. The intruder was clever, knowing I would watch for the obvious signs, leaving just subtle hints to remind me that I was being monitored. I felt trapped, like a wild animal in a cage too large to see the bars, too small to escape. On the third night, it happened again. Heavy steps around the cabin, deliberate pauses, circling, moving back and forth. I stayed in the darkest corner of the main room, breathing slowly, trying to control panic. I realized that I had no idea what the intruder wanted. Money? Supplies? Or just to scare me to see what I would do. Hours passed, and the footsteps finally faded. When I dared to look outside, I saw nothing but the empty forest. No tracks, nothing. It was as if the intruder had vanished. By the fourth day, I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Supplies were limited, my nerves were shredded, and the psychological strain was nearly unbearable. I planned a careful escape. I would leave at first light, taking the long route back to the nearest main road, keeping to the tree line to avoid leaving obvious traces. I packed quietly, keeping the essentials: food, water, the hatchet, and my gun, and I kept checking the windows and doors for signs that I was being watched. I tried to move silently, but the cabin creaked around me, and my own heartbeat sounded deafening. I spent the day exploring the immediate area around the cabin. I needed to see if anyone could have approached unnoticed. The terrain was uneven, the forest dense, with thick underbrush making movement difficult. I followed paths that seemed natural, looking for footprints or other signs of human presence. I found none. Birds had started to sing again, a small reassurance, but my unease remained. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling the weight of the isolation more acutely than before. Inside, I prepared a simple dinner and settled near the stove, keeping a fire burning longer than usual. I inspected the locks on the doors and windows multiple times, each check amplifying the paranoia I tried to suppress. Night fell again, darker than before. The wind rose, whistling through the trees and shaking the cabin. The sounds outside were closer, more frequent. A branch hit the side of the cabin, and I jumped. Every instinct told me to leave, but the nearest town was a 2-hour drive away, and the roads were narrow and unwelcoming in the dark. I tried to occupy my mind by reading and preparing firewood, but the tension grew heavier, pressing against my chest. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyes closed, I imagined the door opening, imagined shadows moving across the walls, imagined footsteps circling the cabin. Around midnight, the sound of movement outside grew more pronounced. It was slow, deliberate, careful. I froze, listening, trying to identify the source. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon. The pattern of movement suggested something larger, something aware. I considered my options. I had a phone, but the signal was weak. I had food, water, and the cabin itself, but I had no weapons and no way to call for immediate help. I felt trapped, the isolation I had sought now suffocating. The sounds continued for hours, until exhaustion forced me to lie down, clutching a heavy stick I had found near the cabin as a makeshift defense. Sleep came in short, fractured bursts, always accompanied by the sense that something was just outside. The following day, I resolved to investigate more systematically. I packed essentials: a small bag with water, food, a flashlight, and the stick, and planned a cautious patrol around the cabin. The forest was denser than I had realized. Every movement made a cracking sound. Every step left a faint imprint in the soft soil. As I moved, I noticed unusual marks on the trees, deep scratches that couldn't have been made by animals. They were erratic, irregular, but purposeful. My heart sank. I was not alone. Whoever or whatever had been moving around the cabin was leaving signs, warning me, testing me. I had no way to know how long they had been observing, but the thought that someone had been watching me since I arrived was terrifying. I returned to the cabin by late afternoon, my nerves frayed. I barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, stacked heavy objects near the entrances, and prepared for another long night. I kept a constant fire burning, the crackling flames a small comfort. I stayed alert, listening to the forest, identifying every sound. Footsteps, branches snapping, the occasional distant animal. But always, in the edges of perception, there were other noises, irregular, cautious, human. The fear pressed inwards, gnawing at my focus, my reason. The night passed in tense vigilance. Morning brought relief, only slightly tempered by exhaustion. I knew I had to leave. Staying was no longer safe. The forest was no longer peaceful, the cabin no longer secure. I packed quickly, securing my belongings, making sure nothing was left behind that could compromise my safety. As I drove away, the cabin shrank in the rearview mirror, hidden quickly by the trees, returning to the silence I had initially sought. The relief I felt was overwhelming, the fear gradually easing as civilization drew nearer. By the time I reached the highway, the panic that had gripped me for days began to fade, replaced by the resolve that I would never return to that cabin, never seek isolation so extreme, and never underestimate the power of true solitude in the wild. Weeks later, I reflected on the experience. The fear, the tension, the constant awareness of the unseen. It had changed me. I understood now that isolation was not peaceful. It could be dangerous, psychologically taxing, and utterly consuming. I had survived because I had remained vigilant, cautious, and rational, but I had been pushed to the edge. The cabin remained a memory, an experience I could recount, but one I never wanted to repeat. I understood the forest differently now, not as a place of beauty alone, but as a living, unpredictable entity, indifferent to human presence, capable of testing the limits of anyone who entered it alone. And with that understanding came clarity. The wilderness demanded respect, preparation, and humility. That clarity stayed with me, a lasting lesson forged in fear, solitude, and endurance. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, a solitary getaway to escape the noise of the city and the constant hum of people. I wanted silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound foreign. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow, unpaved road that wound up for miles through thick pine forests. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden haze over the trees, and the air had a sharp chill that hinted at the coming night. The cabin itself looked as though it had been there for decades. Its wooden siding darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were grimy, reflecting the fading light like dull mirrors. I parked my car on the small patch of dirt in front and walked up to the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, and I made a mental note to check it carefully before leaning on the railing. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke, the latter probably from a fireplace that hadn't been used in some time. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners, glinting in the last rays of sunlight. I carried my backpack inside and set it down, letting the silence wrap around me. It was heavy, almost tangible, pressing in from the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards. I took a deep breath and started to explore, running my fingers along the rough wooden surfaces, opening cupboards and peering into corners. The kitchen was basic, a small stove, a tiny fridge, and a sink with rust around the edges. There was a stack of firewood next to the fireplace and a few chairs scattered haphazardly around the room. I decided to start a fire. Using the brittle wood stacked by the fireplace, I carefully struck a match and watched the flame flicker and grow. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin, cutting through the damp odor. I sat in one of the chairs and listened. Outside, the forest was alive with the faint rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful at first, comforting even. But as darkness crept over the mountains, the sounds of the forest changed subtly, becoming sharper, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing on arranging my supplies and checking the cabin for anything I might need over the next few days. I noticed small details as I moved through the rooms. The floorboards creaking in irregular patterns, the way the windows rattled slightly when the wind blew through the pines, the faint scratching coming from the wall near the corner of the living room. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. But the sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, stopping and starting as though whatever it was testing my attention. By the time I had unpacked and prepared a small meal, the sun had set completely, leaving the forest outside as a black, shapeless mass. I lit a couple of candles, placing them carefully so the shadows didn't stretch too far across the room. The flickering light made the walls appear to shift, the shadows forming strange angles that seemed almost unnatural. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of being alone in such an isolated place. I went to bed early, or at least tried to. The cabin was cold despite the fire, and I layered myself under blankets, trying to will myself to sleep. But the noises outside and in the cabin made it nearly impossible. The scratching continued sporadically, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make me sit up abruptly. My mind started to play tricks on me. Every bump of the floor, every groan of the old wood sounded amplified, like someone, or something, was moving just beyond my sight. Hours passed in this tense, half-conscious state. The fire burned low, and I forced myself to stay awake, telling myself it was safer to be alert than to fall asleep. Around midnight, I finally convinced myself I could check the source of the scratching. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the corner where the noise seemed strongest. As I approached, I saw a small gap between the wallboards, just wide enough to see a pair of glinting eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. My stomach dropped. Whatever it was staring at me from inside the cabin walls. Panic surged, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced through possibilities. Raccoon, stray dog, something trapped and frightened. But the eyes didn't move away. They followed me. The scratching started again, louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, moving within the walls themselves. I backed away toward the door, heart hammering, feeling trapped in the small cabin. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but the forest outside was impenetrable in the dark, and the uneven path would make me easy prey for any number of hazards. I decided to stay put, trying to calm myself. I moved to the fireplace, thinking if I kept the fire going, the warmth and light would make me feel safer. I added more wood, the fire roaring suddenly with a bright orange blaze, sending shadows flickering across the walls. The light revealed the details of the cabin in a way I hadn't noticed before. The rough grain of the wood, the small imperfections, the gaps where the structure had shifted over time. I focused on those details, trying to ground myself, but the scratching persisted. As the hours dragged on, I began to notice patterns. The scratching wasn't random. It moved from one corner of the cabin to another, sometimes near the ceiling, sometimes low to the floor. Occasionally, I heard something heavier, like a knock or a thump, as though whatever was inside the walls had shifted its weight. I remembered a story I had read about people living in rural cabins who had raccoons or rats nest inside the walls, sometimes creating terrifying noises at night. I told myself it had to be something like that. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forest had taken root in my mind, not as a challenge or a thrill, but as a necessary escape. My life had become a blur of screens and noise. I needed silence, solitude, a place where I could be entirely alone with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crack of wood beneath my boots. The cabin I rented was advertised as a rustic, isolated spot in the middle of a state forest, far from roads and neighbors. The pictures showed a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by thick trees and an open clearing. I was drawn to the idea of waking up to a forest sunrise without anyone else around for miles. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, with roads narrowing to dirt tracks and the trees gradually closing in around me like a wall. I remember feeling the first pangs of unease not as fear, but as an acute awareness of how alone I was. By the time I parked near the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that moved eerily between the trees. I carried my pack, heavy with supplies, and walked the short trail to the cabin. The air was cool, damp, and smelled of earth and moss. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just a soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, old, and weathered, but sturdy. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a single room with a wood stove, a small table, a bed pushed into a corner, and a stack of firewood. I set down my pack and let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. The floorboards were uneven, the walls rough-hewn logs, and the windows had thin, cracked panes that let the fading light in. It felt safe enough, but the isolation pressed against me in a tangible way. I unpacked my things slowly, setting out food, water, a small lantern, and a first aid kit. I wanted to be prepared for anything because deep down, I knew that in a place like this, even minor injuries or accidents could become serious problems. That first night, I lit the stove and made a simple meal. The silence of the forest outside was complete, and it pressed against the cabin walls. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet you hear in cities or suburbs. It was thick, expectant, like the forest itself was watching. I felt the hair on my arms prickle and a chill creep down my spine despite the warmth from the stove. I tried to distract myself by unpacking more supplies and organizing my small space, but every little sound, the settling of the cabin, a branch tapping against a window, made me tense. I realized that in all my planning, I hadn't considered just how profoundly alone I would feel. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would chase away the uneasy tension. I left the stove burning low, the flickering light casting shadows across the room, and crawled under my blanket. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't match the rhythm of wind against trees or the faint moan of shifting branches. It was a footstep, or at least something that sounded very much like one, on the dirt and leaves just outside the cabin. My heart hammered against my chest, and I froze, straining to hear. Then another sound, soft, deliberate, coming closer to the cabin. I wasn't imagining it. Something was moving outside, near the door. I debated what to do. There was a small lock on the door, and I had packed a hunting knife, but the thought of confronting whoever or whatever was out there made my stomach churn. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I held my breath. Then a silence so complete it made my ears ache. I tried to convince myself that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, though the careful, precise steps didn't match anything I had heard in the woods before. Hours passed like that. Every time I thought I heard a rustle, my heart jumped, my mind racing through all the worst-case scenarios. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, waking to a pale gray dawn filtering through the windows. The next day, I moved cautiously around the cabin. I inspected the windows and doors, checking that everything was secure. The forest seemed almost normal in the daylight, the birds beginning to call and the wind moving through the trees in a natural rhythm. But the memory of last night's sounds lingered. Every time a branch snapped, I tensed, imagining footsteps on the forest floor. I decided I would spend the day exploring the immediate area, marking trees and noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The forest floor was soft and damp, covered in moss, fallen leaves, and pine needles. Every step I took was muffled, but I could hear the distant hum of insects and the occasional caw of a bird. It felt peaceful, and yet, under the tranquility, there was a tension I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the footsteps from the night before, wondering if I had really imagined them, or if someone or something had been outside my door, watching. As the sun climbed higher, I wandered deeper into the forest, following a narrow path that I hoped would lead me to a stream or a clearing. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, dense and unbroken. I stopped often, listening, trying to pick up any unusual sound, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the wind through the trees. Around midday, I reached a small creek that cut through the forest, its water cold and clear. I knelt at the edge to fill my water bottle, pausing to drink directly from the stream. The sound of rushing water was comforting, grounding me. I stayed there for some time, watching the current twist around stones and roots, noticing the flash of fish beneath the surface. Returning to the cabin felt different that day. The forest, once threatening and silent, seemed to carry a rhythm, a quiet heartbeat, and I felt slightly more at ease. By the second night, I had gathered enough firewood to last several days. I cooked a small dinner and settled near the stove, listening to the crackle of flames. The tension from the previous night had not disappeared entirely, but I began to understand it as the product of isolation rather than any real threat. Still, I checked the windows and door repeatedly before going to bed. Around midnight, I woke again, this time to a more distinct noise. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving from the far edge of the clearing toward the cabin. I froze, realizing immediately that it was not the wind, not an animal. Whatever it was, it had intent. The sound stopped, leaving an eerie silence, and I lay completely still, willing my racing heart to calm. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me again, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I knew I had to leave. I gathered my things, locked everything, and started down the dirt road toward the main highway. The walk was tense. I kept checking behind me, aware of every sound. The forest seemed alive, almost as if it were holding its breath, hiding something I couldn't see. By the time I reached the highway, I was exhausted, shaking, but relieved. A car passed by, and I waved it down, explaining my situation briefly. The driver gave me a ride to the nearest town. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photographs of the footprints and describing the disturbances. They said there had been similar reports in the area, isolated incidents of people trespassing or observing cabins, but nothing violent had ever been reported. They suggested I leave the area immediately, which I did, and I never went back. Looking back, I realize now how vulnerable I had been. Alone, isolated, without immediate help, in a place that seemed peaceful but was not. The fear I felt wasn't supernatural, it was very real, very human. The realization that someone had been watching, that I was being observed in a place where I thought I was safe, was more frightening than any ghost story could ever be. I learned to never underestimate the isolation of the woods, the vigilance of people who choose to lurk in quiet places, and the importance of being prepared for more than just the natural dangers of the wild. The experience stayed with me. I still love the woods, still hike and camp, but I always research my locations thoroughly, never stay completely alone in remote cabins, and always make sure someone knows exactly where I am. The fear of that night is still vivid, the silence of the forest, the feeling of eyes on me, the footsteps in the dark. But so is the relief I felt when I finally reached safety. And in a way, that relief, that return to safety, is more powerful than any moment of fear. I survived, I learned, and I came back stronger, more cautious, but still capable of enjoying the solitude I once craved. Morning came slowly, the first light of dawn spilling weakly through the grimy windows. The scratching stopped as the sun rose, and the forest seemed calm once more. Exhausted, I collapsed into a chair near the fireplace, trying to gather my strength. I knew I couldn't spend the day cowering. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I inspected the walls carefully in the daylight, finding small holes and gaps where the wood had warped. Inside, I could see traces of claw marks, tiny paw prints dusted with dirt that had somehow found its way into the cabin. It was clear now that some animal had taken refuge here, possibly a family of raccoons or squirrels. Relief mixed with lingering fear. It wasn't a human intruder, but the realization that something had been so close and hidden for so long was unsettling. I spent the day cleaning, sealing gaps with whatever I could find in the cabin. I built a small barrier near the fireplace, made sure food was stored away, and tried to make the space less inviting for my hidden guests. I also started to document everything, every noise, every mark, every gap. By doing so, I felt a little more in control. The next night was different. I still heard the occasional scuttle or scratching, but it was quieter, less aggressive. I had set up traps near the areas where the marks were worst, not to harm, but to monitor movement. I slept better than the previous night, though I kept one ear tuned to the walls, ready to respond if needed. Over the following days, I learned the cabin's rhythms. The sounds of the forest, the subtle shifts of the wood, and the movements within the walls became familiar. I could anticipate when the noises would happen and why. I also noticed small signs that whatever had been living inside was leaving, the trails of dirt and bits of fur near sealed gaps. It was slowly moving out, encouraged by my interventions and the growing presence of sunlight. By the end of the week, the cabin was quiet again. The traps showed no activity, the scratches had stopped, and I finally felt safe moving freely. I spent the day cleaning more thoroughly, airing out the cabin, and walking the surrounding area to ensure nothing had made a permanent home too close. The forest had returned to its calm state, and I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. When it was time to leave, I packed carefully, making sure the cabin was secure for the next visitor or owner. I walked back down the winding road, sunlight warming my back, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I had faced the fear of being alone in an unfamiliar place, confronted it in a very real, very tangible way, and emerged stronger and wiser. The cabin remained behind me, silent and intact, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the natural, living world moving quietly just out of sight. Driving back into civilization, I reflected on the experience. I had learned the importance of observation, preparation, and patience. The fear had been intense, but it had not overwhelmed me. I felt a newfound respect for the quiet power of nature, for the animals that share our spaces, and for my own ability to endure and solve problems under pressure. It was a terrifying week, but it ended clearly, with understanding, control, and safety restored. By the third day, I had noticed subtle changes outside. Small saplings were bent or broken, patches of soil freshly disturbed, and sometimes I glimpsed a large shadow among the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was always just out of reach of the flashlight beam, always disappearing before I could see it clearly. My mind ran through every possibility. Bear, moose, escaped animal, human. The thought that it could be a person was horrifying. I checked the door locks repeatedly, barricaded it slightly with a chair, and set up a crude alarm system. Ropes with cans that would clatter if disturbed. Each sound in the night made me jump. Each movement outside made me hold my breath. I felt trapped in a constant state of fear. On the fourth day, I realized I had been surviving on minimal food and water. My body tensed from exhaustion. My mind stretched thin from fear. I decided I had to leave. I packed as much as I could into my backpack and prepared to drive out. The cabin had become a prison, a place where every sound was a threat. As I stepped outside, I saw the tracks again, large, deep indentations in the dirt, moving around the perimeter. I froze. The wind rustled the trees. Then I saw it. Not a shadow, not a shape that could be mistaken, but a large, hulking figure crouched near the tree line, just beyond the clearing. I couldn't see details in the darkness, only the outline, and it didn't move quickly, only slowly watching. My heart almost stopped. I didn't think. I ran. I ran through the clearing, my boots slipping on pine needles, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. I jumped into the car and locked the doors. The figure didn't chase me at first, only observed. I started the engine, and it finally moved, stepping back into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I drove without looking back, following the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel, adrenaline keeping me alert. Every creak of the car, every shadow along the road, made me tense. I kept driving until I reached the main highway hours later. By then, the sky was lightening, and the woods appeared calm and ordinary. The terror of the cabin felt like a fading nightmare. I reported the incident to the local authorities. They noted that no one had reported seeing people or unusual animals in the area, but the markings I described, trees scratched, unusual tracks, made them cautious. They advised me to stay away from that area in the future. Over the next few weeks, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The tracks and scratches didn't match any known animal or human pattern. I considered every rational explanation I could, but the certainty of being watched and tested in that isolated cabin could not be denied. I realized the terrifying truth. Sometimes, the woods are home to things that don't fit any category, things you cannot predict, and you are incredibly vulnerable when alone. Months later, I returned to the area, but only to drive past it, keeping my distance. From the highway, the cabin looked the same, small and innocuous, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Yet I could see the way the trees leaned, the patches of disturbed soil near the clearing. I knew that whatever had been there was likely still there, unseen, watching. That memory stayed with me, a constant reminder of isolation, vigilance, and survival. I never went back inside, never sought solitude in that forest again. But I kept telling myself that I had escaped with my life, that I had survived something unknown but real, and somehow that was enough for closure. The next night, the intruder returned. This time I saw him, or at least a figure moving along the tree line. He stayed just out of the range of the cabin lights, pacing, stopping, watching. My heart thudded so hard I was sure he could hear it. I stayed still, hiding behind the door, flashlight off. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell. The figure eventually retreated, disappearing into the woods. I stayed awake the entire night, adrenaline and fear keeping me alert. By the third day, I realized I couldn't wait this out. I needed to get out, but the road was treacherous in the dark. I would have to wait until morning and drive carefully. I spent the night in a corner of the cabin, every noise amplified in my imagination. Around midnight, I heard a knock at the door. Not violent, just a deliberate knock. My stomach dropped. I didn't answer. The knocking stopped. Then, footsteps retreated. I stayed in that corner until dawn, barely breathing, listening for any sign that he had returned. Morning came, gray and cold. I moved slowly, gathering my things and preparing to leave. I scanned the surrounding trees constantly. The intruder wasn't visible, but the sense of being watched remained. I unlocked the car doors, started the engine, and slowly backed out onto the dirt road. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. I drove carefully, eyes darting constantly to the sides of the road. After what felt like hours but was really only 40 minutes, I reached the main road. Cell service returned, and I immediately called the local police, explaining everything. They promised to send someone to check the area. A week later, I learned that the police found evidence of a squatter in the woods near the cabin. He had been living in makeshift shelters, moving around quietly, careful not to be caught. They found signs that he had observed the cabin for days, and occasionally entered when the occupant was asleep or distracted. He had left quickly when the authorities were nearby. I never returned to that cabin. The owner refunded my money, apologizing for not disclosing the area's occasional trespassers. I kept the experience to myself mostly, telling only a close friend who understood the fear of being truly alone in the woods. That experience stayed with me for years. I realized that isolation can be dangerous, not because of supernatural forces or fairy tales, but because human unpredictability and the vastness of wilderness can leave you vulnerable. I still love the woods, still hike and camp, but I never again stayed in a place without easy access to help. That cabin taught me caution, awareness, and respect for the isolation I once romanticized. The memory of those footsteps outside my window, the quiet figure in the shadows, and the constant tension of waiting and listening never left me. I learned that in real life, fear isn't something that disappears with daylight. It lingers, shaping how you move through the world and how you value safety. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It wasn't a complicated plan. I just wanted to get away from the city, from everything that felt loud, crowded, and relentless. I had rented a small cabin in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest town, a place that promised isolation, quiet, and nothing but the natural sounds of the forest. I had chosen it because of the pictures online. A simple wooden structure tucked between tall pine trees, with a small porch and a fireplace, a place that seemed perfect to forget the world and be alone with my thoughts. I had imagined peaceful nights by the fire, mornings with mist rising from the nearby creek, and the slow, steady rhythm of the woods replacing the constant pulse of the city. The drive there had been longer than I expected. The last 20 miles of dirt road were narrow and full of potholes, twisting between ridges and small hills, flanked by thick forest on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the path. I parked, unloaded my bag, and looked at the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, but solid, made of dark wood that looked like it had been there for decades. The windows were dusty but intact. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic, like iron. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove and a sink, a table with 2 chairs, a small sofa, and a fireplace with a pile of wood next to it. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. There were no lights beyond the single overhead bulb in the main room, and I knew from the pictures that there was no cell signal here. I carried in my supplies, set down my bag, and sat on the sofa for a while, listening. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, making the branches creak and rattle. I could hear birds calling somewhere deep in the forest, and the soft rush of the creek not far from the cabin. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace, lit a few candles, and ate a simple meal I had packed. I had brought plenty of water, canned food, and some snacks. The cabin felt cozy at first, the firelight flickering across the walls, the shadows stretching and dancing in the corners. But as the night went on, the quiet began to feel heavy. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and the thin walls of the cabin. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth sounded unnaturally close. I tried to read, tried to focus on the book in my lap, but I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, there. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking at odd hours, imagining that I heard voices, footsteps, or the brush of something moving just outside. Every time I went to the bathroom or got up to check the door, the shadows seemed to shift in ways that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just nerves, just the isolation playing tricks on me. I had spent time in the woods before. I knew how easily the mind could turn harmless sounds into something threatening, but this felt different. There was a tension in the air, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The second day, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I followed a small trail behind the cabin, winding through the pines and along the creek. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and the ground was damp from a recent rain. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds stopped calling, the wind softened, and I could hear only the crunch of my boots on the wet leaves. I kept my eyes open for wildlife, but saw nothing. No deer, no squirrels, no signs of anyone else nearby. The isolation was peaceful at first, but after an hour, it started to feel oppressive. I turned back, trying to shake off the unease, but the path back seemed longer than I remembered, the trees looking identical, making it easy to feel disoriented. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. My firewood pile had been disturbed. A few logs that I was sure I had stacked neatly were now scattered on the ground. I froze, listening. The forest was still silent. No wind, no rustle, nothing. I told myself again it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a stray deer had gotten too close. I stacked the wood back, but now I felt on edge. Every little noise outside made me tense, my hand brushing the edge of the table as if ready to grab something for defense. That night, the unease turned into fear. The wind had shifted and was howling now, rattling the cabin windows violently. I lay in bed, trying to sleep, but every sound made me startle. The branches scratching against the walls, the occasional thump of something falling outside, the creek suddenly rushing louder in the darkness. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears. The steps stopped. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The following morning, I found more signs that someone, or something, had been near the cabin. My supplies had been moved. Not drastically, just a little. A bag shifted, a can knocked over, the blanket on the sofa slightly folded differently. Nothing else was taken, and the cabin was otherwise undisturbed, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I wanted to leave immediately, but the road was too bad for a quick departure. If I left, it would mean walking miles through the forest to get to a main road, and I didn't know the terrain well. I felt trapped. I spent the day trying to occupy myself. I cleaned, organized, and even chopped some extra firewood, hoping that physical work would calm me. But the sense of being watched never left. Every shadow, every movement in the trees outside, felt like eyes on me. By the evening, I decided to lock the doors and secure the windows as best I could. I checked the locks multiple times, stacked chairs against the door, and placed the firewood pile strategically to block any possible entry. I sat near the fireplace, the only source of light and warmth, and kept my eyes on the darkened windows. That night was the worst. The wind had died down, but the forest had grown eerily silent. No birds, no rustling, just a heavy, pressing quiet. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, outside the cabin. Not random or animal-like, but heavy and consistent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed a fireplace poker and crept to the window, looking through the small curtain gap. There was nothing there. The moon was low, casting dim light on the porch and the surrounding trees, but no one was visible. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching, waiting. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, listening for movement, scanning the windows constantly. When morning finally came, I forced myself to leave the cabin. I walked the trail again, carefully scanning everything, listening for any signs of another person. I didn't see anyone, but I did find footprints. Large, heavy, not like any animal I recognized. Leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin, then back again. My stomach churned. I stayed as calm as possible, took pictures of the prints, and traced the path carefully. It was clear someone had been near the cabin multiple times in the night. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone was coming around the cabin at night. Maybe a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone living out there. Either way, I didn't want to find out by surprise. I decided to take precautions. I stacked a few empty cans near the windows and hung some from a bit of rope by the door so they'd rattle if moved. I also brought in my hatchet and kept it beside the bed. The third night was worse. The fire burned high, but I barely blinked. Every small sound made my stomach tighten. Around midnight, I heard something again, this time from the back of the cabin. It was faint but real, a soft thud followed by the light crunch of snow. Then, for a few seconds, nothing. I could feel the cold pressing through the walls. Then, slowly, a new sound came. The faint metallic clink of cans brushing against each other near the window. I froze. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my neck. The cans rattled again, softer this time, then silence. I sat there in the glow of the fire, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. None came. After maybe 15 minutes, I forced myself to look outside. When I opened the door, cold air rushed in, biting my face. The clearing looked calm. No movement, no shapes, but the cans were swinging slightly on their string, and beneath them, new footprints. They stopped right in front of the door and turned back toward the woods. Whoever had been there must have seen the light and left. The next morning, I followed the tracks again. They led into the trees, weaving between trunks, then stopped near the slope leading to the lake. There, hidden by a fallen log, I found something that made my stomach drop. An old, torn backpack. The straps were frayed, and the zipper was broken, but inside were a few things. A half-empty bottle of water, a knife, and a pair of dirty gloves. The knife's handle was worn smooth. I couldn't tell how long it had been there, but it didn't look abandoned for years, maybe months at most. The more I looked at it, the clearer it became that someone had been living rough out here. Maybe they'd seen my car and cabin lights. Maybe they were curious, or maybe they didn't want me there. I took the knife and carried it back to the cabin. That day dragged on slow. I couldn't focus on anything except the thought of whoever was out there watching. The snow stopped falling, and by evening, the forest seemed too still. No birds, no wind, just that strange, thick quiet. I stayed up again, sitting by the fire, every sense sharp. Around 3 a.m., I heard something different. Not steps or scraping, something heavier. A low crash, like something knocking over wood outside. I jumped up, grabbed the flashlight, and went to the window. The beam caught movement just for a second, a shape ducking behind the woodpile near the back corner. I saw part of a leg, dark pants, then nothing. My throat went dry. I backed away from the window, trying to think. The person wasn't afraid to come close anymore. I moved quietly to the door, latched it fully, and sat back near the stove, keeping the hatchet in my hand. I didn't sleep. For hours, I sat there until faint light came through the window again. When I finally stepped outside, I saw the mess. The stack of wood was half knocked over, pieces scattered across the snow. Fresh prints circled the area, dozens of them. Some went toward the tree line, but one trail led straight behind the cabin toward the back window. There, in the snow beneath the window, was something that stopped me cold. A small strip of fabric caught under a splinter on the sill, dark cloth, maybe from a sleeve or jacket. Someone had leaned close enough to the window that the wood tore their clothing. I stared at it for a long time, the cold seeping into my fingers. I realized I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could quickly: food, water, my bag, the knife. I loaded everything into the car, but when I turned the key, the engine barely groaned. I tried again, pumping the pedal. Nothing. The temperature overnight must have dropped below zero, freezing the fuel line. I sat there in the driver's seat, my breath fogging the windshield, feeling trapped. The nearest main road was miles away, maybe a 4-hour walk through heavy snow. I decided to wait for daylight before trying to leave on foot. I brought my gear back inside, lit the fire again, and spent the whole day preparing. I packed a smaller bag for the hike, loaded it with energy bars, water, and a flashlight. As soon as the sun dipped low, I planned to sleep a few hours and head out early at dawn. But I never slept. Just after sunset, I heard something again outside. Not just one person this time. 2, maybe 3 sets of steps, slow and heavy, crunching through snow around the clearing. They circled once, stopped, then the sound of something tapping lightly against the side wall came. I sat frozen on the bed, the hatchet in my hand, staring at the door. My mind went blank except for one thought. They knew I was in there and they weren't leaving. The tapping turned into scraping. Then came a hard thump against the back wall. Then another. The stove rattled slightly from the impact. I stood, heart racing, and moved to the center of the room. The thuds kept coming, spaced a few seconds apart, as if someone was testing the walls. Then everything went quiet again. Dead quiet. I stayed awake all night, waiting for the sun. When it finally came, I went outside shaking. The first thing I saw were footprints everywhere. Deep, overlapping, circling the cabin several times. Some led toward the trees, others back toward the lake. Near the back wall, I found a long stick like a pole with one end sharpened roughly. It had been used to poke the cabin's walls. I dropped it immediately. That was it for me. I strapped on my snow boots, grabbed my pack, and started walking down the road I came from. The air was painfully cold, and snow came up to my knees in some places. Every sound in the forest made me look over my shoulder. I followed the ruts from my car's tires as far as they went, then just kept heading downhill, hoping I'd reach the main road before dark. After about 3 hours, I stopped to rest and turned back for a second. Through the trees, I saw movement again. Faint, distant. A figure between the trunks, standing still, facing my direction. I couldn't make out details, just a dark outline against the white snow. I didn't wait to look longer. I started walking faster, then running, slipping on ice, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't stop until the forest opened and I saw the first road sign in miles. I made it to a ranger station by late afternoon, frostbitten and exhausted. They drove me back up later that day to get my car using a larger vehicle. When we arrived, the cabin looked the same from a distance, but up close there were new things. The door had deep marks near the handle, as if someone had tried to pry it open. The cans I'd hung were gone, and in their place, nailed into the wood above the window, was a small piece of paper with torn edges. The writing was faint, almost unreadable from weather, but a few words were clear enough to make my chest tighten. It said, "Leave and don't come back." The Rangers didn't find anyone in the area. No other cars, no camps, nothing. They checked the tree line, found old prints half filled with snow, and that was all. They said it was probably squatters, maybe someone living off the grid who didn't want company. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get out of there. I never found out who those people were, or how long they'd been around that cabin. But I can still see the way those footprints circled it in the morning light, how quiet the woods were, how it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I think about the backpack I found, the knife, the stick with the sharpened end. Whoever was out there knew that place better than I ever could. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of snow crunching outside my window. The slow, steady steps of someone walking just close enough to be heard but never seen. I'll never know how long they had been watching before I arrived. But I know this much. When you're deep enough in the woods, far from everyone, silence isn't peace. It's a warning. Eventually, I tripped and fell hard against a fallen log, scraping my hands and knees. I lay there, chest heaving, trying to listen. The steps had stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, terrified that if I moved, whatever was out there would hear me. I realized I needed to conserve my energy and make a plan. I couldn't just wander aimlessly. I remembered the compass in my backpack, which I had almost forgotten in my panic. Fumbling, I turned it on and checked the direction of the cabin, using the sun's last faint light to approximate north. I decided to follow it slowly, carefully, keeping low and quiet, moving in short bursts and stopping frequently to listen. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump, but I kept going, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't let fear control me completely. At some point, I stumbled into a small clearing, and my heart leapt when I saw the faint reflection of moonlight on water. It had to be the lake near the cabin. I approached it cautiously, following its edge, knowing that the cabin was somewhere nearby. I moved along the shoreline, tripping and slipping, until I finally saw the lights of the cabin faintly glowing through the trees. Relief flooded me, mixed with lingering terror. I ran toward the cabin, bruised and bleeding, my heart still hammering, my clothes torn. When I reached it, I slammed the door behind me, bolting it and leaning against it, shaking from exhaustion and fear. The sound of movement in the forest outside continued, but I ignored it, knowing I was safe for the moment. The cabin felt solid, real, and protective, a fragile barrier against the unknown that had haunted me in the woods. The rest of that night I spent awake, listening to the sounds outside, making sure every door and window was locked. I kept a fire burning in the fireplace, and every crackle of the wood reassured me that I was alive, that I had made it through the terror outside. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to calm my thoughts. I realized then how unprepared I had been, how easily fear could take over when the situation changed unexpectedly. I resolved that I would not make the same mistakes again. I would be cautious, deliberate, and never underestimate the forest or the danger of being alone. The following morning, I explored the perimeter of the cabin and the nearby lake in daylight, my fear replaced by careful awareness. I found broken branches and footprints that confirmed someone, or something, had been moving around me during the night. I reported it to the local ranger station the next day, and they confirmed that other hikers had recently spotted a man wandering the forest, possibly dangerous and living off the land. I realized that I had narrowly avoided an encounter that could have ended much worse. The experience left me shaken but alive. I stayed the rest of my trip at the cabin, carefully observing my surroundings, maintaining my awareness, and ensuring I never wandered far alone again. By the end of the week, I had learned a hard lesson. Isolation could be peaceful, but it could also be dangerous, and respect for the wilderness, and the unpredictable elements within it, was crucial. I left the cabin with my body tired, my mind alert, and a deep appreciation for safety, planning every future adventure with far more care. Started as an ordinary weekend. I had driven several hours into the woods to reach the cabin I had rented. The GPS had lost signal miles before the turnoff, and after a long stretch of winding dirt roads, I finally saw the small, wooden structure tucked between tall pine trees. The cabin looked old but solid, the kind of place that could easily pass for abandoned if not for the small trail of smoke curling from its chimney. I parked my car on the uneven dirt clearing, the tires crunching on dried pine needles. As I stepped out, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves mixed with the faint scent of smoke, and I felt a brief surge of anticipation for the quiet isolation that awaited me. The cabin's front porch creaked under my weight as I pushed open the door. The interior was dim but navigable. Dust motes floated in the air, visible in the streaks of sunlight coming through the window. The floorboards groaned with every step, and I noticed a layer of dirt in the corners. Despite the initial sense of neglect, everything seemed intact. An old wooden table, chairs, a small kitchen area with a sink, a stove, and a counter. A set of stairs led to a lofted bedroom, and there was a small bathroom tucked behind the kitchen. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and mildew, I dropped my backpack by the door and started unpacking, setting up a few essentials: a flashlight, a bottle of water, a notebook, and some snacks. The first evening was uneventful. I collected firewood from a small stack near the cabin, arranging it neatly beside the fireplace. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. At first, it was comforting. I was alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature. The fire started easily, and I sat close to it, feeling its warmth spread across my chest and arms. I stared at the flickering flames, thinking about how few people could reach this place and how isolated I really was. That sense of remoteness should have been thrilling, but as darkness fell fully and the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, a subtle unease began to creep in. Around midnight, the wind picked up sharply. The trees swayed violently, and their shadows danced across the walls. The wooden cabin shuddered slightly with each gust, making the floorboards groan and the window panes rattle. I tightened my sweater around myself and tried to focus on the fire. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, too measured, like someone dragging something along the ground. I froze, listening. It stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart began to race. I gripped the flashlight tightly, holding it like a weapon, and forced myself to check the windows. Nothing. Only the swaying trees and the dark, shifting shadows outside. The hours crawled by. I sat in the firelight, listening intently to every sound. My own breathing seemed loud in the silence. The scraping came intermittently, moving around the cabin, sometimes near the back, sometimes closer to the front. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was completely alone and completely vulnerable. There was no one for miles, no way to get immediate help. The thought of being trapped in this isolated cabin with someone or something moving outside was terrifying. I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a bear dragging a branch. Maybe a raccoon looking for food. My rational mind wanted to believe that, but the pattern of the sounds didn't match any animal I knew. By early morning, the wind had died down, and I convinced myself to step outside to investigate. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles and patches of wet soil. I followed the faint tracks around the cabin, hoping to identify what had caused the noises. The tracks were unusual. They weren't human footprints, they were too large and too uneven, but they weren't consistent with any animal either. Deep scratches marked the trees near the edge of the clearing, long vertical gashes in the bark, as if some large, strong creature had clawed them. My stomach churned as I traced the markings. I realized that whatever had been around the cabin last night had not been a small animal. It had to be something very big, very strong, and very determined to stay close. The next day, I forced myself to keep busy. I gathered more firewood, repaired a loose panel near the roof that I feared the wind could dislodge, and cleaned the small kitchen area. I tried to laugh at my own fear, telling myself that being cautious was normal in the woods. Still, I noticed small signs of recent presence that I couldn't explain. A rock moved near the back steps. A branch that had been lying on the ground shifted slightly, and tiny indentations appeared in the dirt clearing where none had been before. Each small detail made my skin crawl. I realized I couldn't relax, couldn't trust the solitude I had come here to enjoy. Every shadow seemed heavier, every wind gust louder, every sound more ominous. That night, I decided to sleep fully dressed, keeping my flashlight, a kitchen knife, and a sturdy branch close at hand. The fire burned low, and I tried to stay awake, listening. Around midnight, the scraping began again, slower this time, closer than ever. It circled the cabin, then paused, then moved away slightly. I realized it was testing me, seeing if I would leave the cabin. The thought of stepping outside made my stomach twist. Instead, I stayed in the corner, shining the flashlight toward the windows, waiting for hours, my body tense, muscles aching, heart hammering. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, ever since I found the small, isolated cabin listed on a local rental site. The pictures showed a rustic wooden structure tucked deep into the woods, far from any road, with a small lake nearby and miles of forest stretching in every direction. I was craving solitude, a break from the constant noise and pressure of work, and the thought of being completely alone in the forest sounded like the perfect escape. I packed carefully, taking food for a week, plenty of water, a stove, warm clothes, and tools. I also carried a map of the area, a compass, and a flashlight with extra batteries, but I didn't expect to need them much. I had convinced myself that it would be a peaceful retreat. The drive there was long and quiet, and as I left the last paved road behind, I started to notice how quickly civilization fell away. The road became gravel, then dirt, and the trees grew denser on both sides. The further I went, the more isolated I felt, but I welcomed it. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows through the tall pine trees. The cabin itself looked just like the pictures, simple and solid, with smoke curling gently from the chimney, which suggested that the previous renter or caretaker had left it warm. I parked my car and carried my bags inside, enjoying the quiet creak of the wooden floor and the faint smell of wood and earth. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and spent the evening looking out the small windows at the lake and forest beyond. The sky turned dark, and the stars came out, far more than I'd ever seen in the city. The silence was complete except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. I felt completely safe, completely free. I went to bed with the sense that I had escaped the world entirely. The following day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I packed my backpack with water, a small first aid kit, and some snacks, and followed a faint trail that led away from the cabin. The trail was narrow and winding, overgrown in places, and I had to push through branches and brush. I noticed that the forest felt thick, almost unnaturally quiet, but I dismissed it as my own heightened awareness. The sun was bright overhead, and the forest was alive with small animals. Squirrels, birds, and the occasional deer crossing in the distance. I wandered for hours, mapping my route carefully in my mind so I could find my way back. The air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth, and I felt completely alone yet oddly comforted by the natural world. By late afternoon, I realized I had walked further than I intended. The trail had disappeared entirely, leaving only rough ground and dense trees in every direction. I could still see the lake from a distance, and I assumed I could head back toward it and eventually reach the cabin. But as I moved, the forest began to change subtly. The trees grew taller and closer together, and the underbrush became thicker. I found myself constantly pushing branches out of the way, and the ground was uneven, making it hard to keep a steady pace. I started to notice strange patterns in the forest. Fallen trees that seemed too deliberately placed, branches that had been snapped, and the occasional impression of heavy footsteps in the mud that did not match my own. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that animals made these marks, that the forest had natural randomness. Still, a growing unease settled in my chest. Night fell faster than I expected. I hadn't planned on being so far from the cabin when darkness came, and the temperature dropped sharply. I had a small flashlight, but it barely cut through the dense shadows of the trees. I considered trying to find the lake by memory, but every direction looked the same, and I feared getting more lost. The panic started to rise in my chest. I could hear distant sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and what I initially thought were small animals moving, but they were too large, too deliberate. I began to feel like I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd stop and spin in place, shining my flashlight, but I never saw anyone, never saw the source of the noises. The forest had turned from peaceful to hostile, and I suddenly realized just how isolated I truly was. My phone had no signal, and I had no way of contacting anyone if something went wrong. I tried to retrace my steps, using the faint impressions I had left earlier, but the forest seemed to have shifted, or perhaps I had lost my bearings entirely. I began to move faster, tripping over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing across the trees in panicked sweeps. The sounds behind me seemed to follow, keeping pace, always just out of sight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst, my lungs gasping in the cold night air. I wanted to call for help, but there was no one to hear me. Every instinct told me to keep moving, but I had no clear direction. I stumbled through the undergrowth, over logs, through thick bushes, and eventually, exhausted, I realized I had no idea where I was. The darkness seemed endless, oppressive, and heavy. I had been so confident earlier, so sure of my plan, and now every step felt like I was sinking deeper into danger. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. My flashlight's batteries were running low, and my hands were scratched and bleeding from thorns and branches. I began to hear it more clearly then, the sound of movement that wasn't mine. Heavy, deliberate steps, not random at all, coming closer. I froze, pressing my back against a tree, trying to calm my breathing. I considered running, but I had no direction and no light. Panic took over. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against my skin, tripping over roots, and sliding down small hills. The sound followed me, sometimes closer, sometimes a step behind, but always there. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal? A human? Couldn't tell. Every rational thought collided with primal fear, and I was completely consumed by it. It began on a cold morning in late October when I first drove toward the cabin I had rented for a solo retreat. I had been feeling restless for weeks, tired of the constant noise of the city, the endless demands of work, and the crowded streets that left me drained. The cabin, which I had discovered by scrolling through countless listings on a rental site, promised isolation, quiet, and the chance to spend days entirely alone, with only the forest around me for company. The photos made it look inviting. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, a small porch with a view of dense trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was far from the nearest town, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive was long. I left early, with the sky still gray and the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The road narrowed as I left the highway, turning into winding asphalt that eventually gave way to dirt and gravel. The map on my phone indicated that I was close, but the lack of road signs made me nervous. I could feel the tension building in my chest with every mile. I told myself this was normal, that the isolation was part of the experience I wanted. By the time I reached the final stretch, the air had grown cooler, the wind sharper. Trees on either side of the road seemed taller and more oppressive as the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Finally, I saw the cabin. It sat slightly down a slope, hidden among the pines and oaks, with a small clearing around it. The structure looked exactly like the photos, though somehow more solid and real. I parked my car, the gravel crunching under the tires. The silence hit me immediately. There were no birds singing, no distant hum of traffic, no human voices. Nothing. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that this was peaceful, that this was what I wanted. But there was a weight to the quiet, something heavy and unfamiliar, pressing down in the spaces between sounds. I spent the first hour walking around the cabin, inspecting the windows, the porch, and the stone chimney. The door opened easily, and inside, the smell of old wood mixed with dust and faint mildew. It had been cleaned, but not recently, and the layers of neglect gave it a sense of abandonment, like the place had been forgotten and left to slowly rot. The furniture was sparse: a wooden table, a few chairs, a small bed with a worn mattress, and a wood stove in the corner. The windows were large, and though they offered great views of the forest, the glass was dusty and streaked, obscuring the outside world slightly. I unpacked my things, laid out my clothes, and stacked some firewood near the stove. The practical tasks helped me feel like I belonged there, that the cabin wasn't as intimidating as it initially felt. By late afternoon, I had a fire going. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and the cabin felt slightly less threatening. I cooked a simple dinner and settled into a chair near the stove, watching the smoke curl and disappear into the chimney. Outside, the forest seemed to darken faster than usual, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the clearing. It was still quiet, but there was a subtle shift, a sense that the air itself had changed. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. I had spent nights alone in the city, in my apartment, and I had felt uneasy before. This was just a different kind of unease, nothing more. Night came, and with it, a deeper darkness than I had expected. The light from the moon was blocked by clouds, leaving the forest outside nearly invisible. I turned on a small lantern, placing it on the table near my chair, and continued to read. Hours passed slowly. Every now and then, I would hear something outside, a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, but it was never close enough to see, never close enough to confirm. My mind wandered, imagining every possibility, every kind of animal that could be in the forest. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a stray dog. I tried to reason with myself. The cabin had been rented out many times. Surely nothing dangerous had happened here recently. Still, the noises gnawed at the edge of my consciousness, an ever-present reminder that I was completely alone. Sleep was uneasy. I tried to rest in the small bed, but every sound made me tense. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. I lay awake, listening, feeling the floorboards shift under the strain of the cold, feeling the cabin itself respond to the outside forces. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, not the erratic noise of animals. My heart raced. I stared at the door, imagining someone there, waiting. I told myself it was impossible, that no one could have come here without leaving obvious tracks. But my imagination refused to calm down. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to a strange sight. The fire I had left burning had died down overnight, and a thin layer of ash covered the hearth. More concerning, the door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it, locked it even. I froze, staring at the space between the door and the frame. Outside, there were no footprints, no signs of disturbance, only the forest, quiet and still. I checked the windows. All were locked as I had left them. I double-checked my car. It was untouched. There was no sign that anyone had entered. My rational mind suggested explanations. Perhaps the wind had forced the door open, but the hinge was sturdy, and the cabin was sheltered from any direct gust. The uncertainty left a cold knot in my stomach. When the sun finally rose, I slipped out through the back door, moving as fast as I dared without running. I kept low, weaving between trees, avoiding open spaces. Hours passed, and my legs ached, my body trembling from fear and exhaustion. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the trees, following me silently as before. But there was nothing, just the forest, quiet now, strangely empty. Eventually, I reached the old logging road I had marked on the map. Relief hit me like a wave. I ran along it, my pack bouncing, my breath sharp in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the point where a car could drive close, and then I ran to it, collapsing inside, shaking from the exertion and fear. I drove slowly at first, scanning the treeline constantly, expecting to see someone emerge at any moment. But the forest seemed to hold its secret, empty and silent, as if the cabin and the night before had been some nightmare I could barely believe. When I finally reached a town large enough to feel safe, I stopped and took a deep breath, letting the tension leave my body in slow waves. I reported the incident to the authorities, showing them the tracks, the snapped branches, and the disturbed areas around the cabin. They took statements, photographed evidence, and assured me that they would patrol the area. It was the first time I felt truly safe in days. I realized that what had happened wasn't supernatural, wasn't some fantastical fear. I had been stalked, hunted even, in a place where no one would hear me scream. The fear had been real, grounded, and terrifyingly human. I never returned to that cabin. I avoided isolated areas for months afterward, choosing busy places where the presence of others provided comfort. But I kept thinking about the forest, about the person who had been there, about how calm they had seemed and how methodical. I thought about how quickly fear could become real when someone watched you without being seen, when silence turned into tension, and when isolation became a trap. I carried those lessons with me everywhere. Never underestimate preparation, always respect isolation, and never assume that a quiet forest means safety. Months later, I revisited the area. Not the cabin itself, but the outer edges of the forest, with law enforcement this time. They confirmed what I had suspected. There had been people living temporarily in that area, using it as a base, moving quietly to avoid detection. The intruder hadn't been supernatural or mythical or unreal. It had been someone human, as ordinary as anyone I might pass on the street, capable of deliberate fear and careful observation. Understanding that made the memory almost worse in some ways, because it reminded me that fear does not need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes, it is simply the presence of another human, patient and watchful, with intentions you cannot know. That summer left a permanent mark on me. I returned to urban life, to friends, to noise and light and crowds, but the lessons remained. Isolation is dangerous, trust must be measured, and even a beautiful, quiet cabin in the forest can be a trap if someone else is watching. The fear fades, but it never disappears entirely, because I now understand that terror is not always supernatural. It is sometimes just reality, sharp and quiet, waiting at the edge of the forest, in the dark, where no one is looking. Even now, years later, I remember the crunch of footsteps on the snow, the smell of wet earth in the cabin, the faint flicker of firelight on the walls, and the realization that I was being watched. I know now that I survived because I was alert, careful, and willing to leave everything behind to preserve my life. And every time I walk past a quiet, empty forest, I feel the knot in my stomach tighten slightly, remembering that not all danger comes with a growl or a shout. Some danger comes silently, patiently, and invisibly, and the only way to survive is to respect it fully.